Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Shrinking Mile. From Jake Martinez. The rain started as gentle drops against my windshield somewhere outside Bakersfield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my dashboard lights like tiny fireflies before sliding down the glass in wandering trails. I'd been hauling freight for 12 years, and there's something about driving through California's Central Valley at 3 in the morning that makes you feel like you're moving through a dream, especially when the weather turns. The steady thrum of my Peterbilt's engine provided a comforting rhythm beneath the growing patter of precipitation, and I settled deeper into my worn leather seat, adjusting my grip on the steering wheel as the road ahead began to shimmer with wetness. My CB radio crackled with occasional chatter from other night owls making their way through the darkness, voices floating in and out like ghosts in the static. "Eastbound Kenworth, you got your ears on?" came a gravelly voice through the speaker, but I was too focused on the increasingly heavy rain to respond. The drops were coming faster now, transforming from gentle taps to insistent drumming against my cab, and I could feel that familiar tension in my shoulders that always came with bad weather driving. In my mirrors, I caught glimpses of the long aluminum trailer I was pulling, its silver surface gleaming wet in the red glow of my taillights. The load was supposed to be furniture bound for Phoenix. Nothing unusual about the paperwork or the pickup. Just standard household goods from a warehouse that looked like 1,000 others I'd visited over the years. The dispatcher had mentioned it was a rush job, something about an estate sale that needed to be delivered before Monday morning, but the extra pay was worth the night drive. As the rain intensified, I noticed something odd in my passenger mirror. The trailer seemed to be sitting lower than usual, closer to the road surface. I chalked it up to the optical illusion created by the water cascading down the mirror's surface, but made a mental note to check the air suspension at my next stop. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated in brief sections by my headlights before disappearing into the wet darkness. Other than the occasional semi heading west with their running lights creating brief constellations in the night, the road was mine alone. The rain had become a steady downpour now, forcing me to increase my windshield wiper speed and reduce my pace to a more cautious 50 miles per hour. The rhythmic swoosh of the wipers combined with the engine's hum created an almost hypnotic atmosphere, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, partly for safety, and partly because something about the trailer's appearance continued to nag at me. It was during one of these mirror checks that I first noticed the trailer definitely looked different. The standard 53-footer I'd picked up that afternoon seemed somehow more compact, its proportions subtly altered in a way that made my stomach tighten with unease. I convinced myself it was just the rain distorting my view, creating optical tricks in the darkness. But as I adjusted my side mirror for a clearer look, the feeling of wrongness only intensified. The trailer appeared to be the same length, but there was something about its height and width that seemed diminished. I pulled into a truck stop near Fresno, the neon signs reflecting in fractured rainbows across the wet asphalt, and performed my routine inspection. Walking around the trailer with my flashlight cutting through the rain, I measured the clearance between the bottom of the trailer and the ground with my eyes, comparing it to the familiar reference points I'd learned over years of hauling. Everything appeared normal. The same air suspension height, the same clearance, the same massive aluminum box I'd been pulling for hours. Yet something fundamental felt wrong, a sensation I couldn't articulate but couldn't ignore. Back in the cab with rain dripping from my jacket, I studied the trailer through my mirrors as I prepared to pull back onto the highway. The loading documentation showed standard dimensions, and my GPS unit indicated the normal weight distribution for the load, but the nagging sensation persisted. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, creating a cocoon of sound around my truck, and as I merged back onto the interstate, I noticed that other drivers seemed to be giving me more space than usual, as if my rig looked different to them as well. Mile after mile passed in the monotonous rhythm of rain and road, and with each passing hour, the trailer's appearance seemed to become more obviously wrong. What had started as a subtle feeling had evolved into a clear visual discrepancy that I could no longer rationalize away. The trailer was definitely smaller than it had been when I'd left the warehouse, not just lower to the ground but narrower, as if the rain was somehow causing the aluminum walls to contract and compress. I tried raising the dispatcher on my cell phone, but the storm was interfering with the signal, leaving me alone with my growing unease. The shrinking effect seemed to accelerate as the rain intensified. During a brief stop at a roadside rest area, I measured the trailer's width by pacing off steps from my cab to the edge. And the number was definitely wrong, at least 2 feet narrower than the standard 8.5 feet it should have been. More disturbing still, the height had decreased so noticeably that I could see over the top of the trailer from my driver's seat, something that should have been impossible with a standard 13-foot 6-inch box. The rain continued to pound against the metal surface, each drop seeming to compress the structure further. Inside the increasingly cramped trailer, I could hear new sounds, not the familiar settling and shifting of furniture, but something that sounded almost like breathing, like the trailer itself was gasping as it contracted. The rear doors remained properly sealed, but I could see that even the door frame had shrunk proportionally, maintaining the trailer's structural integrity while defying every law of physics I thought I understood. The running lights along the trailer's sides were now closer together, creating a more densely packed constellation in my mirrors. As dawn approached, the rain began to ease slightly, but the trailer continued to shrink with mechanical precision. What had started as a standard commercial box was now roughly the size of a small moving van, yet somehow still containing the same load of furniture I'd picked up 12 hours earlier. The impossible geometry hurt to think about, like trying to hold two contradictory truths in my mind simultaneously. Other truckers on the CB radio were starting to take notice, their voices filtering through the static with confusion and concern about the little rig they kept seeing on the highway. The real terror set in when I realized that not only was the trailer shrinking, but it was pulling my tractor unit backward as it contracted, slowly but inexorably drawing my cab closer to its diminishing rear doors. The sensation was subtle at first, like a gentle tug on the kingpin connection, but as the trailer continued to compress, the pull became stronger and more insistent. I tried to disconnect the airlines and electrical cables, but they seemed to have fused somehow to my truck, creating an unbreakable bond between my Peterbilt and the shrinking box behind me. My speedometer began showing impossible readings as the trailer's shrinking mass affected our physics, displaying speeds that didn't match the landscape passing outside my windows. The engine RPMs fluctuated wildly as if the truck couldn't decide how much power was needed to pull its constantly changing load. Most frightening of all, I could feel my cab beginning to compress as well, the roof gradually lowering until I had to hunch forward over the steering wheel, the sidewalls closing in until my shoulders nearly touched the door panels. With desperate inspiration born of pure panic, I spotted an approaching overpass and realized that if I could time it perfectly, I might be able to use the low clearance to my advantage. As the trailer continued to shrink, I calculated that in another few minutes it would be small enough to fit under the overpass while my cab, being pulled backward, would strike the concrete structure and break free from whatever force was compressing us both. The rain was letting up now, but the shrinking continued with relentless mechanical precision, and I knew I had only one chance to escape this impossible trap. I floored the accelerator as we approached the overpass, feeling the trailer's pull intensifying as my cab was drawn backward toward its diminishing form. At the last possible second, I yanked the emergency brake release and threw my truck into the lowest gear, causing the tractor to jackknife violently, just as my trailer disappeared entirely beneath the overpass. There was a tremendous crash of metal and concrete, a shower of sparks that illuminated the pre-dawn darkness like fireworks, and then suddenly I was rolling free on the far side of the bridge, My kingpin connection severed and my truck miraculously intact. In my mirrors, I could see the overpass behind me looking completely normal and undamaged, with no sign of any trailer or cargo or evidence that anything unusual had occurred. My paperwork was gone from the cab. My bills of lading had vanished, and according to my GPS unit, I was running empty with no record of having picked up any load at all. The rain had stopped completely, leaving only the exit 127, the sign that wouldn't let go. From Marcus Chen, the thing about driving long haul is that you start to memorize the exits like old friends. Mile marker 127 on Interstate 40 through New Mexico has always been my favorite stretch. Nothing but desert silence and the kind of darkness that wraps around your cab like a velvet blanket. I've been running this route for 12 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics across the Southwest, and I know every truck stop, every overpass, every faded green exit sign between Albuquerque and Amarillo by heart. That's why I noticed it immediately when something changed. It was 3:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, the kind of crisp desert night where the stars seem close enough to pluck from the sky. My Peterbilt's headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness ahead, and the steady rumble of the Cummins engine beneath me had settled into that hypnotic rhythm that makes the miles disappear. The radio crackled with distant trucker chatter, voices floating across the airwaves like ghosts sharing stories in the dark. I was making good time, running ahead of schedule for once when I spotted the exit sign illuminated in my headlights. Exit 127 Mineral Wells Road, but something was wrong. The sign looked different somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what had changed. The letters seemed sharper, more defined than usual, as if someone had just installed a brand new sign in place of the weather-beaten one I'd grown accustomed to seeing. The green reflective surface gleamed with an almost metallic sheen that seemed to hold my headlight beams a fraction of a second longer than it should have. I found myself staring at it in my side mirror as I passed, watching it shrink into the distance until the darkness swallowed it completely. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it left me with an odd feeling, like when you walk into a room and forget why you came there. 30 miles down the road, I saw it again. This time I was sure something was wrong. Exit 127, Mineral Wells Road, standing right where exit 154 should have been. I knew this stretch of highway like the back of my weathered hands, knew that exit 154 was supposed to be Tucumcari Boulevard, not some repeat of a sign I'd already passed. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed exactly what I expected. Tucumcari Boulevard, exit 154. The contradiction sent a cold finger of unease trailing down my spine. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe the endless succession of white lines and the monotonous hum of tires on asphalt were finally getting to me. 12-hour driving shifts can play tricks on your mind, make you see things that aren't there or remember things that never happened. But when I looked again, the sign was exactly as I'd seen it. Exit 127, Mineral Wells Road, gleaming in that same unnaturally pristine condition. I grabbed my CB radio and keyed the mic. Breaker 19, this is Midnight Express eastbound on the 40 at mile marker 154. Any drivers out there notice anything strange about the signage tonight? Static filled the cab for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. Midnight Express, this is Iron Horse. Been running this route all night, partner. Signs look normal to me. You feeling all right up there? Roger that, Iron Horse. Just thought I saw something peculiar. Thanks for the check, but I hadn't imagined it. The sign was wrong, and as the miles rolled by beneath my 18 wheels, a growing certainty began to settle in my chest like a cold stone. Something was following me. 25 miles later, there it was again. Exit 127, Mineral Wells Road, standing impossible and defiant where exit 179 should have announced the approach to the state line. This time I pulled over, engine idling in the breakdown lane, emergency flashers painting the desert scrub in rhythmic orange bursts. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravelly shoulder, and stared up at the sign. It looked absolutely real, solid and official, mounted on standard highway department posts. The retro-reflective material caught the light from my truck's headlights and threw it back with that familiar green glow I'd seen thousands of times before. But this sign had never existed here. This sign belonged 30 miles behind me, marking an exit I'd already passed. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite and sagebrush, carrying with it the scent of dust and the distant promise of rain. Above me, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled flour, beautiful and indifferent to whatever impossible thing was happening on the road below. I reached for my cell phone to take a picture, thinking maybe I could make sense of this later. But the camera showed only empty darkness where the sign should have been. My hands started to tremble as I climbed back into the cab. The diesel engine's familiar rumble, usually so comforting, now seemed to pulse with an ominous undertone. I considered calling dispatch, maybe reporting some kind of highway maintenance issue, but how do you explain something that doesn't show up in photographs? How do you file a report about a sign that shouldn't exist? I decided to push forward, hoping that whatever strange phenomenon I was experiencing would resolve itself with distance. But as the miles accumulated on my odometer, exit 127 kept appearing with clockwork regularity. Every 20 to 30 miles there it would be, standing sentinel in exactly the same spot relative to my position, as if it were somehow anchored not to the highway but to me. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall as I approached the Texas border, fat droplets spattering against my windshield and turning the desert air thick and electric. I switched on the wipers, their rhythmic sweep adding another layer to the symphony of sounds that filled the cab. The engine's steady growl, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the vast emptiness. That's when I noticed the sign was getting closer. Instead of appearing at its usual distance ahead, exit 127 now materialized just 50 yards from my front bumper, close enough that I could see every detail of its construction. The metal posts seemed newer than they should have been, free of the rust and weathering that marked every other sign on this stretch of highway. The letters themselves appeared to have been cut with laser precision, their edges sharp enough to draw blood. As I drew nearer, I could see something else that made my breath catch in my throat. There was text below the exit designation, smaller letters that I'd never noticed before. My headlights swept across the sign's surface, and for just a moment I could read what it said. Exit 127, Mineral Wells Road, Marcus Chen only. My name. The sign had my name on it. I jerked the steering wheel, fighting the urge to swerve as shock coursed through my system like electricity. The trailer behind me swayed slightly, a gentle reminder of the laws of physics that still governed my 40-ton rig, even as the laws of reality seemed to be breaking down around me. I managed to keep the truck steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The sign passed by my driver's window, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it if the glass had been down. As it slipped behind me, I caught a glimpse of something else that shouldn't have been there. A second sign identical to the first, already visible in the distance ahead. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the CB radio again, my voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mayday, Mayday, this is Midnight Express with a potential emergency situation on eastbound Interstate 40 approaching the Texas line. I need immediate assistance from any available units. The radio crackled with static, then silence. I tried again, switching to the emergency channel, but got nothing except the soft hiss of white noise. It was as if every other truck on the highway had simply vanished, leaving me alone with whatever impossible thing was stalking me through the desert night. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the roof of my cab with increasing intensity. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating towering thunderheads that seemed to stretch from the highway to the stars. In those brief moments of brilliant illumination, I could see them, exit signs stretching ahead of me like a line of soldiers, each one identical, each one bearing the same impossible message. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my speed up to 75, then 80 miles per hour. The speedometer needle climbed past numbers I'd never dared to hit while pulling a full load, but I had to try to outrun whatever was happening. The signs blurred past now, appearing and disappearing in my peripheral vision with increasing frequency, as if they were the muffled mile. From Marcus Chen, I've been hauling freight across the Pacific Northwest for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of strange town this region had to offer. Mill towns where the sawdust never settles, fishing villages that smell of salt and secrets, mining communities that cling to mountainsides like desperate fingers. But Stillwater Falls was different from the moment I downshifted my Peterbilt into its city limits. Different in a way that made the fine hairs on my arms stand at attention beneath my flannel sleeves. It was 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of deep autumn night when fog rolls in thick as cotton batting, and the air carries the promise of winter. My load of agricultural equipment was bound for Salem, but a mechanical issue with my trailer's air brakes had forced me to take the scenic route through the Cascade foothills, following a winding state highway that my GPS seemed reluctant to acknowledge existed. The road signs had been growing increasingly weathered and sparse, their reflective paint dulled by years of mountain weather, and when I finally spotted the modest wooden marker that read, Stillwater Falls, population 847, established 1923, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The town materialized out of the mist like something from an old sepia photograph, its main street lined with the standard assortment of small-town businesses, a diner with flickering neon, a hardware store with painted wooden signs, a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration. What struck me first was how perfectly preserved everything appeared, as if time had simply decided to pause and linger in this particular pocket of Oregon. The streetlights cast pools of amber light that seemed unusually bright against the fog, and I could make out the silhouettes of modest homes climbing the gentle slopes that bracketed the main thoroughfare. What struck me second was the silence. Now, I need to explain something about life on the road. After 15 years behind the wheel, you develop an acute awareness of sound. The diesel engine's steady rumble becomes your heartbeat. The whisper of air breaks your breathing, the subtle variations in tire noise your constant companion. You learn to read the acoustic signature of every place you visit, the industrial hum of truck stops, the gentle whoosh of highway traffic, the complex symphony of sounds that emanates from any living community. Even at 3 in the morning, even in the smallest towns, there's always something. A dog barking in the distance, the hum of electrical transformers, the whisper of wind through power lines. Stillwater Falls was utterly, completely silent. I downshifted as I entered the main business district, my engine's diesel rumble echoing between the storefronts in a way that felt almost intrusive. The sound seemed to die as soon as it left my truck, swallowed by the fog and the strange, expectant stillness that hung over the town like a blanket. I found myself instinctively easing off the throttle, as if my truck's presence was somehow inappropriate in this hushed landscape. The gas station's overhead canopy was illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered in irregular patterns, casting dancing shadows across the cracked concrete. I pulled up to the diesel pumps, noting that the prices displayed on the old mechanical sign seemed remarkably reasonable for this remote location. As I climbed down from my cab, the sound of my boots hitting the pavement seemed unnaturally loud, each footstep echoing briefly before being absorbed into the pervasive quiet. The station's interior was bathed in the harsh white glow of overhead fluorescents, their humming providing the first familiar sound I'd encountered since entering Stillwater Falls. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged man with graying hair and deep-set eyes, reading what appeared to be a decades-old copy of Field and Stream. He looked up as I entered, offering a polite nod that somehow conveyed both welcome and warning. "Evening," I said, my voice sounding strangely flat in the small space. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" "Quiet night," he replied, his words carefully measured. "That's what we prefer here in Stillwater Falls. Quiet nights." I paid for my fuel and purchased a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the Clinton administration. The attendant watched me with those deep-set eyes, and I found myself somewhat unnerved by his steady gaze. "You passing through?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Just filling up," I confirmed. "Got a delivery in Salem taking the back roads because of some brake issues." He nodded slowly, as if this explanation satisfied some internal requirement. "Well, you drive careful now. These mountain roads can be tricky, especially at night, especially when folks aren't used to our way of doing things up here." There was something in his phrasing that made me pause, coffee cup halfway to my lips. "Your way of doing things?" "Keeping things quiet," he said simply. "We value our peace and quiet here in Stillwater Falls. Have for generations." I returned to my truck with a vague sense of unease that I couldn't quite articulate. The fog seemed to have thickened during my brief stop, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 feet in any direction. As I fired up the Peterbilt's engine, I noticed something odd. The diesel rumble that had seemed so intrusive before now sounded muffled, dampened, as if the very air was absorbing the sound waves before they could travel. The main street stretched ahead of me like a tunnel through the mist, the amber streetlights creating isolated pools of visibility. I shifted into first gear and began rolling forward, maintaining a cautious speed as I navigated through the town center. The residential streets that branched off from the main thoroughfare disappeared into the fog like secret passages, and occasionally I could glimpse the warm glow of house windows floating in the mist like distant stars. It was then that I began to notice the sounds, or rather, the way sounds behaved in Stillwater Falls. My truck's engine, which normally produced a steady, penetrating diesel growl, seemed strangely contained, as if someone had wrapped the entire vehicle in acoustic insulation. The sound stayed close to the truck, refusing to propagate through the fog-shrouded air in the normal fashion. Even more unsettling, I began to hear other sounds, distant and distorted, that seemed to emerge from the fog itself. A child's laughter, thin and silvery, drifted from somewhere to my left, though I could see no children in the empty streets. A woman's voice calling someone's name with urgent concern echoed from the direction of the residential area, though the words were too distorted to understand. The faint sound of music, something that might have been a piano or perhaps an old radio, wavered in and out of audibility like a signal from a distant station. These sounds shared a peculiar quality. They seemed old somehow, as if they had been traveling through the fog for years, decades even, gradually losing clarity and definition, but never quite fading away entirely. They layered upon each other in ways that defied physics, creating an acoustic landscape that felt both intimate and impossibly vast. I pressed on through the town, following the main street as it curved gently to the right, passing a small city park where the skeletal branches of leafless trees emerged from the fog like reaching fingers. The sounds continued to accumulate around me. Fragments of conversation, the distant bark of a dog, the squeal of children at play, the rumble of what might have been other trucks passing through on long-ago nights. They formed a kind of ghostly soundtrack to my journey, present enough to be clearly audible, but always seeming to originate from just beyond the reach of my fog-limited vision. As I approached what appeared to be the far edge of town, I noticed a figure standing beside the road. It was an elderly woman in a heavy coat, perfectly motionless despite the late hour and the thick fog. I slowed my truck as I passed, intending to offer assistance if needed, but as my headlights swept across her position, I saw that she was simply standing there, head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Her lips were moving, I realized, forming words that produced no sound, as if she were speaking into a void that swallowed her voice before it could reach the air. She made no acknowledgement of my truck's presence, remaining focused on her silent conversation with the fog-shrouded night. I accelerated past her, suddenly eager to reach the town limits and return to the familiar acoustic environment of the open highway. But as I drove, I began to understand something disturbing about the sounds that filled the air around my truck. They weren't random environmental noise or the product of my imagination. They were conversations, fragments of daily life, pieces of human activity that seemed to have been captured and preserved in the very atmosphere of Stillwater Falls. A man's voice, discussing crop prices with someone whose responses I couldn't quite make out. A teenager complaining about the midnight reveille. For Marcus, the thing about driving long haul is that your body learns to sleep through anything. Engine noise, air brakes hissing at truck stops, even the occasional honking horn becomes white noise after 15 years on the road. So when something wakes you up in the middle of your mandatory rest period, you know it's either serious trouble or something your mind can't quite categorize as normal. I'd pulled into a rest area outside Flagstaff around 11:30, one of those dimly lit spots where the vending machines cast sickly yellow rectangles on cracked asphalt, and the restrooms smell like industrial disinfectant fighting a losing battle. My Kenworth was tucked between two other rigs close enough that I could hear the gentle tick-tick-tick of cooling engines through my sleeper cab walls. The kind of mechanical lullaby that usually sends me straight into dreamland. But at 3:17 in the morning, something pulled me from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. The gentle rumble that had been my constant companion for the past 400 miles had simply stopped. My rig was stone-cold silent, which was impossible since I always kept the auxiliary power unit running to maintain climate control in the sleeper. I lay there in my narrow bunk, listening to the profound quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums like cotton. Even the usual truck stop sounds had vanished. No distant highway traffic, no refrigerated trailers cycling on and off, no drivers walking past talking on their phones, just silence so complete it made my ears ring. That's when I heard it, a low rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not the familiar diesel growl I knew so well, but something deeper, more organic. Like breathing, like something massive drawing air into lungs the size of oil barrels. I pulled back the curtain of my sleeper window and peered out into the rest area. The other trucks were still there, dark and silent as tombstones. But beyond them, at the far edge of the parking area where the asphalt gave way to desert scrub, I could see headlights. Two perfect circles of amber light that seemed brighter and warmer than any halogen bulbs I'd ever seen. The breathing sound grew stronger, and now I could feel it as much as hear it. A gentle vibration that traveled up through the ground, through my truck's suspension, through the mattress beneath me. Rise and fall, with the slow patience of something that had been sleeping far longer than any human ever could. I should have started my engine and gotten back on the highway right then. Should have trusted the ice water feeling in my veins that told me something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Instead, I found myself pulling on my boots and jacket, drawn by the kind of curiosity that makes people slow down to look at accidents on the freeway. The night air hit my face like a cold slap, sharp with the scent of sage and something else I couldn't identify. Something metallic and warm like heated steel. My footsteps echoed strangely in the silence as I walked across the empty rest area, past the shuttered information kiosk with its peeling paint and broken fluorescent fixture. As I got closer to those headlights, details began to emerge from the amber glow. The outline of a truck cab, but not quite like any I'd seen before. The proportions were wrong somehow, too tall and wide, with curves that seemed to flow like liquid metal frozen in motion. The grille was massive, a chrome mouth filled with what looked like teeth instead of the usual horizontal slats. The breathing sound was definitely coming from this truck, though I still couldn't see a driver behind the windshield. The glass was tinted so dark it might as well have been painted black, reflecting my own pale face back at me as I approached. But I could feel something watching from within that cab, something that had noticed my presence and approved of my curiosity. The truck's engine wasn't running in any conventional sense, yet it pulsed with life. The hood rose and fell almost imperceptibly with each breath, and I could see a faint red glow emanating from somewhere underneath, like embers in a banked fire. The whole machine seemed poised on the edge of wakefulness, like a sleeping giant that might open its eyes at any moment. That's when I noticed the trailer, where I expected to see a standard box van or flatbed. There was instead something that looked almost organic. The sides curved inward and outward in a rhythm that matched the breathing, and the surface wasn't metal or fiberglass, but something that looked disturbingly like skin. Dark, leathery hide stretched over a framework that shifted and settled with each exhalation. I reached out to touch it, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. The surface was warm under my palm with the slight give of living flesh. I could feel a pulse beneath my fingers, slow and powerful as a whale's heartbeat, and underneath that I could hear something else. Voices maybe, or just the sound of air moving through vast internal spaces. The truck's headlights suddenly blazed brighter, casting my shadow long and dark across the desert behind me. I spun around to face the cab, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw eyes behind that black windshield. Not human eyes, but something larger and older, with the patient intelligence of a predator that had learned to wait for its prey to come willingly. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs. The truck loomed over me, headlights boring into my skull like searchlights, and I realized with growing horror that I had walked much farther from the rest area than I'd thought. The other trucks were tiny points of light in the distance, and the highway seemed miles away instead of just a few hundred yards. The truck's engine turned over with a sound like a mountain clearing its throat. Not the familiar diesel rattle I expected, but something deeper and more complex, full of harmonics that made my bones vibrate. The headlights swiveled to track my movement as I took a step backward, then another. That's when I started running. I sprinted across the desert hardpan, my boots slipping on loose gravel and hidden rocks, the truck's lights painting my desperate flight in stark amber relief. Behind me, I could hear it beginning to move. Not with the rumble of wheels on pavement, but with something more like the whisper of scales across sand. It was following me, but slowly, patiently, like it knew I had nowhere to go, that it couldn't eventually reach. I made it back to my Kenworth in record time, fumbling with keys that seemed determined to slip from my sweating fingers. The engine turned over on the first try, filling the cab with familiar, comforting sound and vibration. I threw the transmission into gear and pulled out of that rest area without bothering to check my mirrors, hitting the highway at speeds that would have earned me a hefty fine if any state troopers had been watching. It wasn't until I was 20 miles down the road that I finally looked back. The rest area was dark and empty, just another forgotten dot of civilization swallowed by the desert night. No amber headlights, no breathing truck, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there at all. But sometimes, when I'm pulled over for my mandatory rest period and the world gets too quiet around me, I can still hear it, that slow, patient breathing that seems to come from the earth itself. And I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the next driver curious enough to investigate headlights that shine too bright in the desert darkness. I don't sleep as deeply as I used to. Some things, once they wake you up, make sure you never quite drift off the same way again. The company of the road. From Jake Hendricks, I've been driving long haul for 15 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything the highway had to offer. The loneliness that settles into your bones after midnight, the way shadows play tricks on tired eyes, the strange folks you meet at truck stops that smell of diesel and desperation. But nothing prepared me for what started happening 3 weeks ago on Interstate 40, somewhere between Oklahoma City and Little Rock. It began as just another routine run, hauling electronics from California to Georgia in my 18 Peterbilt. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time through the Oklahoma plains. The sun had set hours earlier, leaving me with nothing but the steady rumble of my engine and the endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing under my headlights. I had the CB radio on low, catching occasional chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just static and the comfortable hum of the road. That's when I first heard them. At first, it was so faint I thought it might be interference on the radio or maybe an echo from my own engine, bouncing off an overpass, a distant rumbling like thunder that never quite rolls away. I adjusted the volume on the CB, thinking maybe another driver was having transmission trouble, but the sound didn't change. It seemed to be coming from somewhere far ahead of me, beyond the reach of my headlights. I glanced at my GPS and saw nothing unusual. No construction zones, no reported accidents, just the straight shot of I-40 stretching into the Arkansas darkness. The rumbling continued, growing neither louder nor softer, maintaining a steady, almost rhythmic quality that reminded me of a heartbeat. I pressed a little harder on the accelerator, curious to catch up to whatever was making the sound. But after several miles, it remained just as distant as before. By the time I reached my overnight stop in Little Rock, the sound had faded completely. I figured it must have been another convoy that had taken a different route, maybe headed north toward Missouri. These things happen on the interstate. Sound carries strangely at night, bouncing off the landscape in ways that can fool you into thinking something is closer or farther than it really is. I didn't think much about it until the next night. I was making the return trip, dead heading back toward Oklahoma with an empty trailer, when the rumbling started again. This time it was unmistakable. Multiple engines, diesel by the sound of them somewhere ahead in the darkness. The noise had a weight to it, a presence that seemed to press against my windshield and vibrate through the steering wheel. I tried raising other drivers on the CB, asking if anyone else was hearing what I was hearing, but I got nothing back except static. The strange thing was the consistency of it. No matter how fast I drove or how many miles I covered, the convoy ahead of me maintained the exact same distance. The sound never grew louder, never faded, never changed its rhythm. It was as if I were chasing ghosts made of diesel smoke and chrome, always just beyond the next hill or curve. I started paying closer attention to the odometer, timing how long the sound lasted each night. On that second encounter, it continued for exactly 47 miles before disappearing somewhere near the Oklahoma border. I marked the spot on my GPS, planning to investigate during daylight hours, but when I drove through the same stretch the next day, there was nothing unusual to see. Just the same rolling hills and wheat fields that had been there for decades. The third night, the convoy was back, and this time I was ready for it. I had positioned myself at the same mile marker where the sound had started before. Engine idling, CB radio turned up high. Right on schedule at 11:43 p.m., the rumbling began. But there was something different about it now. Something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and sent a chill down my spine despite the warm September air. It was definitely louder than before. Not dramatically so, but enough that I could feel it in my chest as well as hear it through the window. The sound had more depth to it, more presence, as if the convoy had grown by another truck or two. I tried to count the individual engines by listening carefully to the overlapping rhythms, but they seemed to blend together into one continuous mechanical heartbeat that made it impossible to distinguish where one ended and another began. Over the following nights, the pattern continued with disturbing regularity. Every time I drove that stretch of I-40, the convoy would appear at the same time and place, and each night it grew a little louder, a little more substantial. By the end of the first week, the sound was strong enough to rattle my side mirrors. By the end of the second week, it had become a roar that drowned out my own engine and made conversation on the CB impossible. Other drivers started to notice. I began picking up fragments of worried chatter on the radio, trucker voices cutting through static to ask if anyone else was hearing the phantom convoy. Most dismissed it as atmospheric interference or military exercises from a nearby base, but a few, the old-timers who had been running these routes for decades, spoke in hushed tones about similar experiences from years past. One of them, a gravel-voiced driver who went by the handle Nighthawk, told me over coffee at a truck stop outside Shawnee that he had encountered the same phenomenon back in 1987. According to him, it had lasted for exactly 30 days before vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. He advised me not to try getting too close to the source of the sound, though he wouldn't explain why. When I pressed him for details, his weathered face went pale and he just shook his head, muttering something about walking into a storm you can't see coming. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and by the start of the third week, I had made up my mind to catch up to whatever was making that sound, no matter what it took. I modified my route to hit that section of highway earlier in the evening, giving myself a head start before 11:43 p.m. I pushed my Peterbilt harder than I had ever pushed it before, watching the speedometer climb past legal limits as I raced through the Oklahoma darkness. The fuel gauge dropped steadily, but I didn't care. I had to know what was out there. When the rumbling started right on schedule, I was already doing 85 in the passing lane with my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator. For the first time since this all began, the sound seemed to be getting closer. The mechanical roar grew stronger and more complex, revealing layers of engine noise that suggested not just a few trucks, but an entire fleet, maybe dozens of vehicles moving in perfect formation through the night. My headlights began to catch something in the distance. Not the distinct red taillights I expected, but a strange diffuse glow that seemed to hover just above the road surface like heat shimmer on summer asphalt. As I drew nearer, the glow resolved into what looked like the aurora borealis, sheets of pale green and blue light dancing across the highway ahead of me. That's when I realized the convoy wasn't just loud anymore. It was enormous. The sound that filled my cab wasn't coming from a dozen trucks or even 100. It was the combined roar of what seemed like thousands of vehicles, an endless procession of engines that stretched from horizon to horizon. The lights I was seeing weren't headlights or taillights, but something else entirely. An ethereal radiance that outlined massive shapes moving through the darkness ahead of me. As I got closer, details began to emerge from the glow. I could see the silhouettes of truck cabs and trailers, but they were wrong somehow, distorted and elongated as if stretched by distance or time. Some appeared to be older models, the kind of rigs my father might have driven back in the 60s, while others had configurations I didn't recognize, designs that seemed to belong to some future version of the highway. The CB radio crackled to life, filled with voices speaking in urgent whispers. But these weren't the familiar calls of drivers I knew. The words were strange, sometimes in languages I couldn't identify, sometimes in English but using highway terminology I had never heard before. They spoke of routes that didn't exist, destinations that weren't on any map, cargo that couldn't be described in any earthly terms. I was now close enough to see individual trucks in the convoy, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The nearest trailer was hauling something that glowed with its own internal light, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the vehicle carrying them. Behind it, another truck pulled a flatbed loaded with what looked like pieces of highway themselves, sections of asphalt and guardrail that writhed and twisted as if they were alive. But what terrified me most was the realization that some of these trucks looked familiar. I recognized the paint scheme on one cab as belonging to a driver I had known years ago, a man named Phil Garrison who had disappeared somewhere in Arizona back in 2015. Another bore the logo of a shipping company that had gone out of business decades before I ever got my CDL. The Living Interstate. From Marcus Chen. The headlights of my Peterbilt cut through the Nevada darkness like twin searchlights, illuminating the endless ribbon of asphalt that stretched toward the horizon. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, and I knew every mile marker, every curve, every truck stop between here and Colorado. The CB radio crackled with the familiar voices of other night drivers, their conversations a comforting backdrop to the steady rumble of my diesel engine. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something different about the highway beneath my wheels. The usual vibration of tires on asphalt had changed, becoming softer somehow, more yielding. I chalked it up to road work, maybe a fresh layer of that rubberized asphalt they'd been experimenting with on some stretches. The Department of Transportation was always trying new materials. searching for surfaces that would last longer under the constant pounding of 18-wheelers like mine. The radio had gone quiet an hour ago, the last trucker signing off somewhere near the California border. Now there was only the hum of my engine, the whisper of wind across my cab, and that strange new sensation beneath my tires. It felt almost like driving on a giant sponge. Each revolution of my wheels meeting with a soft resistance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something I couldn't quite identify. I reached for my coffee thermos, taking a long sip of the bitter brew that had kept me alert through countless nights on the road. Through my windshield, the stars scattered across the desert sky like scattered diamonds, beautiful and distant. The moon hung low on the horizon, casting everything in silver light that made the landscape look otherworldly. Out here in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but sagebrush and Joshua trees for company, a man could start to imagine things. But what I was feeling wasn't imagination. The highway surface had definitely changed, becoming more elastic with each passing mile. When I downshifted for a gentle grade, I could feel the road responding differently to my weight, almost absorbing the impact of my loaded trailer instead of reflecting it back up through the suspension. It was like driving on something organic, something that gave way, and then slowly returned to its original shape. The first visual confirmation came when I crested a small hill and saw the road ahead illuminated in my headlight beams. The white lines that marked the lane seemed to be moving, undulating in slow waves from the center line to the shoulders and back again. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with one hand while maintaining my grip on the steering wheel. Long-haul truckers were notorious for seeing things that weren't there, mirages born of exhaustion and endless miles of sameness. But when I looked again, the lines were still moving, rippling like painted stripes on the surface of a calm lake, disturbed by some creature swimming beneath. I eased off the accelerator, letting my speed drop from 70 to 60, then 50. The movement became more pronounced as I slowed, the entire surface of the highway seeming to breathe beneath my tires with long, slow inhalations and exhalations that made my cab rock gently back and forth. I pulled out my cell phone, thinking to call dispatch, but there were no signal bars this far out in the desert. The CB radio remained silent when I tried to raise another driver, broadcasting into empty air that seemed to swallow my words before they could travel more than a few feet from my antenna. The isolation pressed in around me like a physical thing, making me acutely aware that I was alone out here with whatever was happening to the road beneath me. The headlights picked up more details as I continued forward at reduced speed. The asphalt had taken on a different texture, no longer the familiar rough surface I'd driven over thousands of times before. Instead, it looked smooth and slightly moist, like skin that had been exposed to humidity. The yellow center line had developed what looked like small pores or follicles, tiny dark spots that seemed to contract and expand as I watched them in my mirrors after passing over. When I applied the brakes to slow for what my GPS indicated was a sharp curve ahead, I felt something that made my stomach lurch with sudden terror. Instead of the usual firm resistance of brake pads against rotors, there was a moment of give, as if the road surface itself was trying to grip my tires and hold them in place. The sensation lasted only a few seconds before the brakes engaged normally, but it was enough to send cold sweat rolling down my back, despite the warm air blowing from my heater vents. The curve revealed a straight stretch of highway that extended for several miles across the flat desert floor, and in the distance I could see what looked like brake lights from another vehicle. Relief flooded through me at the sight of another traveler, someone else who might be experiencing the same strange phenomena, and could confirm that I wasn't losing my mind to highway hypnosis or caffeine withdrawal. I pressed the accelerator, eager to catch up and make contact. As I drew closer, however, I realized that what I was seeing weren't brake lights at all. They were some kind of bioluminescent patches in the road surface, glowing red nodes that pulsed in synchronized patterns like the beating of an enormous heart. The highway around these patches had begun to rise and fall in regular intervals, creating gentle hills and valleys, where the terrain had been perfectly flat just hours before when I'd last driven this route in daylight. My truck climbed these new undulations with a motion that felt less like rolling over solid ground and more like riding the swells of an ocean. At the crest of each rise, I could feel my trailer lift slightly before settling back down into the trough that followed. The sensation was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, making me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of the solid earth beneath the asphalt. The radio crackled suddenly, startling me from my fascination with the undulating road ahead. But instead of a human voice, what emerged from the speaker was a low, rhythmic sound like breathing, punctuated by what might have been a heartbeat amplified through electronic speakers. I quickly turned the volume down, but I could still hear it underneath the sound of my engine, a biological rhythm that seemed to be synchronized with the pulsing of the red patches in the highway. That's when I noticed that the white lane markers had begun to change color, shifting from their usual reflective white to a pale pink that reminded me uncomfortably of the inside of a mouth. The surface texture visible in my headlight beams was becoming increasingly organic, developing what looked like a network of fine capillaries spreading outward from the center line toward the shoulders of the road. I tried to steer toward the right shoulder, thinking to pull over and wait for dawn, but as my front wheels approached the edge of the pavement, the surface there suddenly bulged upward, forming a ridge that guided my truck back toward the center of the lane. It was a gentle correction, almost helpful, but the implication was terrifying. The road was alive, and it didn't want me to leave. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, enough to reach the next town if I could maintain normal speed, but the highway seemed to be growing more responsive to my presence with each passing mile. When I accelerated, I could feel it yielding beneath my weight like muscle tissue adjusting to pressure. When I braked, there was that same gripping sensation, as if invisible fingers were trying to hold my tires in place. The red patches were becoming more frequent now, appearing every few hundred yards in clusters that reminded me of nerve ganglia or lymph nodes. They pulsed in sequence as I passed over them, creating a wave of light that traveled from behind my trailer to somewhere far ahead where my headlights couldn't reach. I had the unsettling feeling that my passage was being announced, that something far up the road was being informed of my approach by these biological signal stations. Then I saw the exit sign in my headlight beams, a blessed green rectangle that promised escape from this nightmare highway. Route 318 toward Caliente, a road I'd taken before when construction had closed the interstate. I downshifted and signaled my intention to turn, even though there was no other traffic to warn, the habitual gesture of a professional driver maintaining protocol even in impossible circumstances. But as I approached the off-ramp, the surface began to slope inward, creating a depression that pulled my wheels away from the exit and back toward the main highway. I held the steering wheel firmly, fighting against the road's attempt to guide me, feeling the truck's tires slide sideways on the increasingly slick surface. For a moment it seemed I would miss the exit entirely, carried past it by the highway's living current. With a final desperate turn of the wheel and a burst of acceleration that made my engine roar, I managed to break free from the main highway's grip and climb the exit ramp toward Route 318. In my mirrors, I could see the interstate behind me rippling and writhing like something in pain, the red patches flashing in rapid sequence as if calling me back. But the surface of the exit ramp was solid asphalt, real and familiar and blessed normal beneath my tires. The road that dreams remember, from Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you start to know every highway like the lines on your weathered hands. Interstate 80 through Nebraska, Route 40 across the Mojave, Highway 10 through the Louisiana bayous, they all have their personalities, their moods, their secrets. But there's one stretch of asphalt that's been haunting me for the better part of a decade now. A route that shouldn't exist according to any map I've ever consulted, yet appears with unsettling regularity in the periphery of my exhausted consciousness. It always starts the same way. I'll be pushing through the night somewhere in the vast emptiness between cities, my 18-wheeler's diesel engine humming its familiar lullaby. When fatigue begins to settle over me like a heavy blanket, the white lines blur together in my peripheral vision, and my eyelids grow heavy despite the thermos of black coffee cooling in my cup holder. That's when I know I need to find a truck stop, need to pull over and catch a few hours of sleep before continuing my journey. But sometimes, just sometimes, the road has other plans. The first time it happened was outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd been driving for 14 straight hours, delivering auto parts to a warehouse in Phoenix, when the drowsiness hit me like a physical weight. My head began to nod, and I caught myself drifting into the right lane more than once. The smart thing would have been to pull over immediately, but I was young and foolish then, convinced I could push through to the next truck stop. That's when I saw the exit sign glowing softly in my headlights. Scenic Route 447, Canyon Vista Drive. The strange thing was, I'd driven this stretch of highway dozens of times before, and I'd never noticed that particular exit, but there it was, as real as the steering wheel in my hands, with a gently curving off-ramp that seemed to promise a peaceful place to rest. Without really thinking about it, I guided my rig down the ramp and found myself on a 2-lane road that wound through desert landscape, bathed in silver moonlight. The road curved gently to the left, then to the right, following the natural contours of the land in a way that felt almost organic. My headlights swept across sagebrush and red rock formations, casting long shadows that danced and shifted as I navigated each bend. The engine seemed quieter here, its rumble muffled somehow, as if the very air was different. Even the radio, which had been crackling with late-night static, felt completely silent. I drove for what felt like hours along that winding road, searching for a place wide enough to safely pull over my trailer. The curves came one after another, each one revealing more of the same ethereal landscape, bathed in that peculiar silver light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile, and more than once I found myself wondering if I was already dreaming. That's when I began to notice the other vehicles. At first, it was just glimpses in my mirrors, distant headlights following the same curved path behind me. But as the night wore on, I started to see more of them. Cars from different eras, their shapes just familiar enough to be recognizable but somehow wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. A sedan that might have been from the 50s, its chrome bumper gleaming despite the darkness. A pickup truck with rounded fenders that belonged to another decade entirely. And behind them all, more headlights, forming a slow procession along the endlessly winding road. The strangest part was how they all maintained the exact same distance from each other, never gaining ground, never falling behind, as if we were all trapped in some kind of automotive amber, frozen in an eternal curve that had no beginning and no end. I tried to speed up, pressing harder on the accelerator, but my speedometer remained steady at exactly 45 miles per hour. No matter how much pressure I applied to the pedal. It was then that I began to understand the true nature of the road I'd found myself on. This wasn't just any highway. This was the route that curves in dreams, the path that exists only in the liminal space between waking and sleeping. Every driver who had ever nodded off behind the wheel, every trucker who had fought to keep their eyes open through the long dark hours, eventually found themselves here, following the gentle bends of a road that existed nowhere and everywhere at once. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange sense of peace. The endless curve was hypnotic, almost meditative, and I found myself understanding why so many drivers seemed content to simply follow its path forever. There was no stress here, no deadlines to meet, no dispatchers calling to ask about delivery schedules. Just the gentle hum of the engine, the soft glow of the dashboard lights, and the eternal sweep of headlights across an unchanging landscape. But even in dreams, some part of the waking mind remains alert, and that part of me began to rebel against the seductive comfort of the endless road. I started to notice details that hadn't been evident before. The other vehicles weren't just from different eras. Some of them were distinctly wrong, their proportions subtly distorted, their lights glowing with colors that didn't quite exist in the waking world. And the landscape itself, while beautiful, had a quality of repetition that suggested it wasn't quite real, like a movie set designed to look convincing from one particular angle. More disturbing still were the glimpses I caught of the other drivers. Most kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, their faces slack with the peculiar contentment of those who have surrendered to the dream. But occasionally one would turn to look at me as I passed, and their expressions held a desperate kind of pleading that chilled me despite the warm air flowing through my cab. They were trying to tell me something, trying to warn me, but the thick glass of their windows and the strange acoustics of the dream road muffled any sound they might have made. It was the sight of my own truck, several cars ahead in the procession, that finally broke the spell. There was my distinctive red Peterbilt with its custom chrome exhaust stacks, following the same curve I was navigating, driven by a figure who looked exactly like me but whose shoulders sagged with the weight of infinite resignation. The me behind that windshield had been driving the curve for who knows how long, perhaps years or decades, trapped in the endless loop of the dream road. Panic began to set in then, cutting through the dreamy contentment like a knife. I had to get off this road, had to find a way back to the waking world before I became just another resigned figure in the eternal procession. I began looking desperately for an exit, any kind of break in the landscape that might offer an escape route. But the road continued its gentle curves with no variation, no opportunities for departure. That's when I remembered the oldest trucker's trick for fighting sleep: physical discomfort. I rolled down my windows, letting the cool night air rush through my cab. I turned up the radio as loud as it would go, though it still produced nothing but silence. Most importantly, I bit down hard on my tongue, using the sharp pain to anchor myself to my physical body, wherever it might be in the waking world. The effect was immediate and disorienting. The silver landscape began to flicker like a dying fluorescent light, and the other vehicles in the procession started to fade in and out of existence. The road itself seemed to stretch and distort, its gentle curves becoming impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. Through it all, I kept my foot firmly on the accelerator, and my hands locked on the steering wheel, using the pain in my tongue as a lifeline back to consciousness. The transition happened all at once, like surfacing from deep water. I found myself parked on the shoulder of Interstate 40, my hazard lights blinking rhythmically in the pre-dawn darkness. According to my logbook, I'd been stopped for exactly 8 minutes, barely enough time for the kind of detailed dream I remembered. But the taste of blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue was real enough, and the sense of having traveled impossible distances along curves that existed only in sleep remained vivid and unsettling. Since that first experience, the dream road has visited me 7 more times over the years. It never appears when I'm fully alert or completely exhausted, only in that dangerous middle ground where consciousness begins to fray around the edges. Each time I recognize it immediately, the gentle curve that seems to promise rest, the procession of vehicles from different eras, the strange silver light that illuminates nothing and everything. I've learned to escape it now, usually through the same technique of deliberate pain that freed me the first time, but the memory of those other drivers haunts me, especially the ones whose faces showed they were still aware of their predicament, but unable to break free from the curve. I wonder sometimes if they were truckers like me who simply couldn't find their way back, who let the seductive comfort of the dream road claim them permanently. The fog that remembers. From Eddie Valdez. The thing about driving the overnight haul from Sacramento to Portland is that you learn to appreciate the silence between radio stations. The way your 18-wheeler's diesel engine becomes a lullaby at 3 in the morning, and how the yellow lines on Highway 5 can hypnotize you into a kind of meditative trance. I'd been running this route for 12 years, knew every truck stop, every way station, every stretch where the CHP liked to hide behind overpasses. But that November night somewhere north of Redding, I encountered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the road. The fog rolled in like it had business to attend to, thick and purposeful, swallowing my headlight beams until they barely reached 20 feet ahead. I'd seen plenty of fog in my years behind the wheel, but this felt different, heavier somehow, as if it carried more than just moisture and night air. The temperature gauge on my Peterbilt showed normal, but I could feel a chill seeping through the cab despite the heater running full blast. The radio had gone to static an hour back, leaving me with only the steady rumble of the engine and the rhythmic thump of my tires hitting the seams in the asphalt. That's when I first heard them, the footsteps. At first, I convinced myself it was just the fog playing tricks with sound, maybe carrying the echo of my own truck's movement back to me in strange ways. But as I downshifted for a long grade, letting the engine brake do its work, the footsteps continued. Steady, measured like someone walking alongside my trailer at an impossible pace. I rolled down my window despite the cold, letting the November air stream into the cab, and the sound became clearer. Definite footfalls on wet pavement, keeping perfect time with my reduced speed. I pressed the CB radio button, hoping to raise another driver, anyone who might be dealing with the same weird atmospheric conditions. Breaker 19, this is Big Eddie northbound on the 5, anybody out there copy? The response was nothing but white noise and the occasional pop of distant lightning, though I couldn't see any storm clouds through the impenetrable gray wall surrounding my truck. The footsteps grew more distinct as I continued through the fog, and I began to notice they weren't quite in sync with my truck's movement. They had their own rhythm, their own purpose. Sometimes they seemed to come from the right side of my trailer, sometimes from the left, and occasionally, and this made my hands tighten on the steering wheel, they sounded like they were coming from directly above, as if someone was walking along the top of my cargo container. I'd hauled everything from furniture to electronics over the years, but tonight I was carrying a load of antique items from an estate sale, bound for a collector in Oregon. The manifest listed things like vintage clothes, old photographs, personal effects from some family's lifetime accumulation of memories. Nothing that should have made noise, nothing that could explain the sounds that seemed to be following me through this impossible fog. The engine temperature stayed normal, but my dashboard lights began to flicker intermittently, casting strange shadows in the cab. Each time the lights dimmed, the footsteps seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I found myself counting them without meaning to, left, right, like a marching cadence that never broke stride no matter how I adjusted my speed. Then I began to hear voices. They started as whispers carried on what should have been non-existent wind, since the fog hung so still and heavy around my truck. Fragments of conversation, half-heard words that sounded like they were coming from right outside my passenger window. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Multiple voices now, men and women, maybe even children, all talking at once in that strange, muffled way voices carry in heavy fog. I tried the CB again, switching through channels, desperate for human contact. "Any driver out there, this is eastbound." I caught myself. I was heading north, wasn't I? I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only a gray void with a small truck icon floating in empty space. No roads, no landmarks, just that electronic representation of my Peterbilt suspended in digital nothingness. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, if such a thing was possible. My headlights now threw back more light than they pushed forward, creating a bright wall of white that made it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. I had to slow to barely 30 miles per hour, following the rumble strips on the shoulder to keep myself oriented, hoping I wouldn't rear-end a stalled vehicle or miss a curve that would send me into a ditch. That's when I realized the footsteps had multiplied. What had started as one set of measured steps had become dozens, maybe hundreds. It sounded like a crowd of people walking alongside my truck, their feet hitting the pavement in an irregular symphony of movement. Some walked fast, some slow, some with the quick patter of small feet that could have belonged to children. The voices grew clearer too, though I still couldn't understand the words. They seemed to be calling to each other, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, like the sounds of a gathering that had been going on for years. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out the passenger window, but the beam disappeared into the fog before illuminating anything. The sounds continued close enough that I should have been able to see their source, but the gray wall revealed nothing. My CB crackled with what sounded like fragments of old conversations. Voice reports from drivers who might have passed this way years ago, layered on top of each other until they became an incomprehensible babble. The GPS suddenly flickered back to life, showing my location on Highway 5, but according to the display, I was somehow traveling on a stretch of road that had been closed for construction 3 years ago. I remembered that project. They'd rerouted traffic for 6 months while they rebuilt a section that had been damaged by flooding. But here I was apparently driving on pavement that shouldn't exist, surrounded by fog that carried impossible sounds. I tried to focus on the basics. Keep the truck moving. Follow the road. Trust the path beneath my wheels. But the footsteps were getting closer, and now I could hear them clearly enough to distinguish individual gaits. An elderly shuffle here, a confident stride there, the quick skip of someone running to catch up. It was as if an entire community of people had decided to take an evening stroll alongside my truck, invisible companions keeping me company through the supernatural fog. Then I heard the knocking. It started soft, just a gentle tap 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 on the side of my trailer, like someone trying to get my attention. Then it spread. Knocks from all along the length of my cargo container, dozens of hands politely requesting entry. The sound was patient but persistent, and it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the November air streaming through my window. I accelerated slightly, hoping to outrun whatever was happening around my truck, but the sounds kept pace effortlessly. The knocking became more insistent, and I could swear I heard voices calling my name, though I hadn't introduced myself to anyone since leaving the truck stop in Red Bluff hours ago. "Eddie," they seemed to say. "Eddie, we've been waiting for you." My hands were shaking now as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to maintain control of both my truck and my nerves. The fog showed no signs of thinning, and according to my GPS, when it worked, I should have been out of this weather pattern 50 miles ago. The dashboard clock seemed to have stopped at 3:17, though I was sure I'd been driving in these conditions for much longer than that. The knocking on my trailer grew more urgent, and now I could hear what sounded like fingernails scratching against the metal sides of the cargo container. Long, deliberate scratches like someone writing messages I couldn't read. The voices were clearer now, too, and I began to make out individual words. "Remember us, and don't leave us behind, and we're still waiting." That's when I understood what I was carrying. The estate sale items in my trailer weren't just old furniture and vintage clothes. They were the physical remnants of people's lives, personal effects that held memories and emotions and maybe something more. The fog wasn't just weather. It was those memories made manifest, following their earthly possessions on one last journey, unable to let go of the things that had defined their existence. I reached for my CB microphone with a trembling hand and tried once more to make contact with the outside world. "Mayday, mayday. This is Eddie Valdez on Highway 5. I need help. There's something wrong with..." The radio erupted in a cacophony of voices, dozens of different people all trying to talk at once, layering their words on top of each other until it became a wall of sound that filled the cab. But through the chaos, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, calling out the same mayday from what sounded like years ago, the temperature of memory. From Jake Donovan, the old Peterbilt's heater had been acting up for 300 miles, spitting lukewarm air that barely cut through the December chill seeping in around the door seals. I'd been nursing this rig across the Montana plains for the better part of 2 days, hauling a load of farm equipment down to Colorado, and the forecast promised nothing but dropping temperatures and possible snow before I reached Denver. The dashboard thermometer read -8 degrees, and I could feel the cold creeping into my bones despite the layers of flannel and the thermal underwear my wife Sarah had insisted I pack. That's when I remembered the radio tucked away in the sleeper compartment, something I'd picked up at a truck stop outside Billings from an old-timer who seemed eager to get rid of it. Strange fellow, that one, with milky eyes that never quite focused on my face when we talked. He'd practically shoved the thing into my hands for $20, muttering something about how it would keep me warm on cold nights like these. The radio itself was a curious piece, built like they used to make them back in the 50s, all chrome and bakelite with a warm amber glow behind the dial, heavy as a cinder block and twice as solid, with that satisfying weight that spoke of quality craftsmanship from an era when things were built to last. I pulled over at a rest stop somewhere between nowhere and nothing, just a concrete pad with a couple of picnic tables buried under snowdrifts and a single flickering light that cast long shadows across the frozen ground. The wind howled across the open prairie, rocking the 18-wheeler back and forth like a boat at anchor, and I could hear the weather stripping around the windows, whistling in harmony with the gale. After fishing the radio out from behind my pillow, I plugged it into the 12-volt outlet and was surprised when it hummed to life immediately, that amber glow spreading across the dial like honey poured over golden wheat. The first thing I noticed was the warmth. Not just the gentle heat radiating from the radio's housing, which was pleasant enough, but something deeper and more encompassing, as if the very air around the device had taken on a different quality. Within minutes, the cramped sleeper compartment felt as cozy as a cabin fireplace, that bone-deep cold retreating, until I found myself shedding layers and settling back against the pillow with a contentment I hadn't felt in weeks on the road. The radio itself seemed to pulse with that amber light, dim, then bright, then dim again, like the steady breathing of something alive and peaceful in sleep. I turned the dial slowly, expecting the usual mix of late-night talk radio, country music, and static that filled the airwaves in these remote stretches of highway. Instead, I found something far more interesting. The first station I landed on was playing music from the 40s, big band numbers with rich brass sections and crooning vocals that seemed to wrap around me like warm velvet. The sound quality was remarkable, crystal clear despite the radio's obvious age, with a depth and richness that made me feel as though I was sitting in some elegant ballroom watching the musicians perform live. But it was the announcer between songs that really caught my attention. His voice had that smooth professional quality of old-time radio, cultured and warm, with precise diction that painted pictures in the mind. He talked about the weather as if he were standing right there beside the truck, mentioning how the temperature had dropped to -8 degrees and how the wind was picking up across the Montana plains. He recommended staying warm and keeping close to loved ones on nights like these, his voice carrying an intimacy that made me feel less alone in that vast, frozen landscape. As the night wore on, I found myself completely absorbed in the programming. There were old mystery shows that had me on the edge of my seat, comedy programs that made me chuckle softly in the warm amber glow, and musical selections that seemed chosen specifically for my tastes. The radio continued to generate that wonderful heat, turning the sleeper compartment into a perfect sanctuary against the bitter cold outside. I could hear the wind still howling around the truck, occasionally rocking the trailer with particularly strong gusts. But inside my little bubble of warmth and entertainment, none of that seemed to matter. It was during a particularly engaging mystery program, something about a detective tracking a killer through the fog-bound streets of old San Francisco, that I first noticed something odd about the commercials. They were advertising products and businesses that seemed strangely local, despite the fact that I was picking up this signal hundreds of miles from anywhere. A hardware store in Billings was having a sale on snow shovels. A diner just off Highway 2 was promoting their famous apple pie and hot coffee for weary travelers. A mechanic in Great Falls was offering 24-hour service for truckers with heating problems, mentioning specifically that he could fix Peterbilt heaters and had experience with the exact model year I was driving. That last detail sent a small chill through the warmth surrounding me. Though I couldn't quite put my finger on why it seemed so unsettling, I'd never mentioned my truck model to anyone at that rest stop in Billings, and the radio had been packaged in an old cardboard box that gave no indication of who might eventually purchase it. But the commercial continued. The announcer's smooth voice listing services and prices with an enthusiasm that seemed almost personal, as if he knew exactly who was listening and what they needed. The mystery program resumed, and I tried to shake off my unease by focusing on the detective's investigation. The story was expertly crafted, with atmospheric sound effects that made the foggy street seem real enough to touch. I could hear footsteps echoing on wet pavement, the distant sound of foghorns from the bay, the creak of old wooden buildings settling in the damp night air. The detective was closing in on his quarry, following a trail of clues through increasingly narrow alleyways that seemed to twist and turn like a maze. But as the story progressed, I began to notice that the detective's investigation was taking him through locations that sounded remarkably familiar. He followed the killer past a rest stop with flickering lights and snow-covered picnic tables. He tracked footprints across a concrete pad where a lone 18-wheeler sat idling in the wind. The fog in the story began to sound suspiciously like the howling Montana wind outside my own truck, and the footsteps on wet pavement took on the rhythm of someone walking slowly around a parked vehicle. The warmth from the radio had grown almost uncomfortably intense, and that amber glow had taken on a pulsing quality that seemed to match my own heartbeat. I reached for the dial to change stations, but my hand stopped halfway when the detective in the story began describing his final approach to the killer's hiding place. He was moving carefully across frozen ground, the announcer said, approaching a large truck where a single light cast long shadows across the snow. The killer was inside, the detective whispered, probably listening to the radio, unaware that he was being watched. That's when I heard the footsteps outside my own truck. Slow and deliberate on the frozen concrete of the rest stop, they circled the rig once, twice, 3 times, crunching softly in the snow that had begun to fall while I'd been absorbed in the radio programming. The sound was exactly like what I'd been hearing through the radio speakers, that same careful pace and rhythm that the detective had been following in his pursuit of the killer. I reached quickly for the radio's power switch, but the moment my fingers touched the warm bakelite surface, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, pregnant with possibilities and thick with unspoken threat. The radio's amber glow continued to pulse, brighter now, casting shifting shadows around the sleeper compartment that seemed to move independently of the light source. The mystery program had gone quiet too, nothing but soft static hissing from the speakers. Then, barely audible beneath the electronic whisper, I heard breathing that wasn't my own, slow, measured breaths that seemed to be coming from just outside the truck, close enough to fog the windows if the glass hadn't already been coated with frost. The radio's warmth had become stifling, oppressive, like being wrapped in heavy blankets on a summer day. I forced myself to move, grabbing my jacket and keys while keeping one eye on the radio. The amber glow flickered once, twice, then settled into a steady burn that seemed to be watching me with patient malevolence. The breathing from the speakers had grown louder, more distinct, accompanied now by what sounded like fingernails tapping against glass. Starting the Peterbilt took 3 tries, the cold engine turning over reluctantly, before finally catching with a rumble that drowned out whatever sounds might have been coming from outside the cab. I threw the truck into gear and pulled away from that rest stop faster than was probably safe, the trailer fishtailing slightly on the icy pavement before I got it under control. The silver passenger. From Marcus, the CB radio crackled with static as I pulled my Freightliner into the way station just outside of Barstow, California. It was one of those desert nights where the air hangs thick and still, despite the late hour, and the neon signs from distant truck stops created an eerie glow against the star-studded sky. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Phoenix to Los Angeles for the better part of 15 years, and this route had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. The steady hum of my diesel engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt usually provided a kind of meditation. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity I couldn't quite name. I was adjusting my logbook when I saw her standing beneath the flickering fluorescent light of the station's information board. Even from a distance, something about her appearance struck me as unusual. Her skin seemed to catch and reflect the harsh artificial light in a way that made her appear almost luminescent, like polished chrome or freshly fallen snow under moonlight. She wore a simple dark dress that hung loosely on her slight frame, and her long hair moved gently in the desert breeze. What caught my attention most, though, was how still she stood, perfectly motionless except for that hair, as if she were a statue someone had placed there and forgotten. The way station was officially closed at this hour, which made her presence all the more curious. Most hitchhikers knew better than to wait around government facilities, and there were no other vehicles in sight that might have dropped her off. Yet there she remained, patient as stone, facing the highway with an expectant posture that suggested she was waiting for something specific. I finished my paperwork and was preparing to pull back onto the interstate when she turned toward my truck, and even through the distance and the glare of my headlights, I could see her raise one pale hand in a gesture that was unmistakably a request for a ride. Company policy strictly forbade picking up hitchhikers, and my own experience had taught me to be cautious about strangers on the road, especially in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. But something about her stillness, her patience, and the almost ethereal quality of her appearance stirred a compassion in me that overrode my usual caution. The desert could be unforgiving to someone stranded without transportation, and she looked so small and vulnerable standing there in the harsh light. Against my better judgment, I pulled the truck over and rolled down my passenger window. She approached with smooth, unhurried steps, and as she drew closer, I could see that my initial impression had been accurate. Her skin possessed an unusual quality that seemed to go beyond mere pallor. It had a metallic sheen that reminded me of polished silver, reflecting the ambient light in subtle, shifting patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect. Her features were delicate and symmetrical, with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. And when she smiled up at me, her teeth gleamed white as fresh snow. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice soft and melodious with just the faintest trace of an accent I couldn't place. "I need to get to Los Angeles." "I can pay for gas." She held up a small leather purse, and I noticed that her fingers, too, had that same silvery quality, as if they were made of liquid mercury that had somehow been given form and substance. "Climb on up," I heard myself saying, though part of my mind was still processing the strangeness of her appearance. "I'm headed that way anyway." She moved with fluid grace as she climbed into the cab, settling into the passenger seat with the same purposeful stillness she displayed at the way station. The interior lights revealed even more clearly the unusual nature of her skin, which seemed to shimmer and flow like captured moonlight, beautiful and mesmerizing but undeniably otherworldly. As we pulled back onto the interstate, she introduced herself simply as Luna, which seemed fitting given her luminous appearance. She spoke in measured tones about needing to reach family in the city, but her explanations remained vague, and I found myself studying her reflection in the passenger window more than I probably should have. The desert landscape rolled past us in familiar patterns of shadow and distant light, while the steady vibration of the road beneath our wheels created its usual soporific rhythm. What struck me most about Luna was her complete stillness. In 15 years of driving, I'd given rides to perhaps a dozen people, and they all fidgeted, adjusted their position, played with their phones, or made restless movements that spoke to the human need for constant motion. Luna, however, sat perfectly motionless except when she spoke or turned her head to look at something. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her posture erect but relaxed, her breathing so subtle I sometimes wondered if she was breathing at all. The miles passed in comfortable conversation about the desert, the stars, and the strange beauty of the nighttime highway. Luna's voice had a quality that seemed to blend with the engine's hum and the whisper of wind around the cab, creating an almost musical backdrop to our journey. She asked thoughtful questions about my work and my life, listening to my answers with an attention so complete it felt like being studied, though not in any way that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't until we were climbing through the San Bernardino Mountains that I began to notice the first truly unsettling details. When Luna reached for the water bottle I'd offered her, I saw in the dashboard lights that her reflection in the windshield was somehow different from her actual appearance. While she sat solid and present beside me, her reflection seemed to shimmer and fade, sometimes disappearing entirely when she moved her head at certain angles. I told myself it was a trick of the curved glass and the interplay of interior and exterior lighting, but the discrepancy nagged at me with growing insistence. Another oddity became apparent when we passed through areas of cell phone coverage and my radio picked up distant stations. Luna would stiffen almost imperceptibly whenever electronic signals grew strong, her silvery skin seeming to ripple and fluctuate like the surface of disturbed water. During these moments, the truck's electrical systems would experience minor glitches. The dashboard lights would flicker, the radio would crackle with static, and once, the GPS screen displayed a location that couldn't possibly be correct, showing us somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The most unnerving discovery came when we stopped at a 24-hour truck stop in Victorville for fuel and coffee. Luna asked to remain in the cab, claiming she was tired and preferred to rest, but when I glanced back from the pump, I could see her through the windshield, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Her silvery skin was moving, shifting, and flowing like liquid metal, reforming itself in subtle but unmistakable ways. Her features remained essentially the same, but details changed. The shape of her nose, the curve of her lips, the spacing of her eyes, as if she were fine-tuning her appearance to match some internal template. When I returned to the truck with coffee, Luna appeared exactly as she had when I'd left. That same ethereal beauty and perfect stillness, but now I couldn't unsee what I'd witnessed. My hands trembled slightly as I started the engine, and I found myself stealing glances at her throughout the remainder of our journey, looking for signs of that strange metamorphosis. She seemed to sense my change in mood, because her own demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more watchful, more alert, like a predator that knows it's been detected. We were descending into the Los Angeles basin, the city's lights spreading out before us like a vast electronic constellation, when Luna finally revealed her true nature. "You've been watching me," she said, her voice carrying a new undertone that resonated strangely in the confined space of the cab. "You've seen what I really am." As she spoke, her skin began to shift more dramatically, the silvery surface rippling and flowing like mercury, revealing glimpses of something darker and more complex beneath. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible over the engine noise and my own thundering heartbeat. Luna turned to face me fully, and I could see that her eyes had changed, becoming larger, more multifaceted, like polished obsidian surfaces that reflected impossible depths. "I am what your kind made," she replied, her form continuing to change and shift. "Born from the electromagnetic dreams of your devices, given substance by the collective unconscious of your digital age. I feed on the signals that surround you, the invisible rivers of information that flow through your world like blood through veins. And I have been looking for someone who could see me clearly, someone whose mind could contain the truth of what I am." The truck's electrical systems began to fail in earnest now, the lights flickering wildly, the radio cycling through stations in rapid succession, the engine's computer struggling to maintain proper function. I realized with growing horror that Luna was drawing power from every electronic system within the dashboard that smiled back. From Marcus Chen, I've been driving long haul for 23 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the highways could throw at a man. Blizzards that turn your windshield into a wall of white static, fog so thick you're navigating by instinct and prayer, desert heat that makes the asphalt shimmer like water. But nothing prepared me for what happened during that humid August run from Memphis to Jacksonville, when my dashboard decided it was hungry. The trouble started 3 days into what should have been a routine freight haul. My 2018 Kenworth had been running smooth as silk since I'd picked her up from the lot 2 years prior. All gleaming chrome and midnight blue paint that caught the highway lights just right. She was my pride, that truck. With her leather-wrapped steering wheel and custom sound system that could make Merle Haggard sound like he was sitting right there in the cab with you. The dashboard was pristine black composite, all clean lines and soft curves, with gauges that glowed a gentle amber in the darkness. It was somewhere outside Valdosta, Georgia, with Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees like ghostly curtains and the air thick enough to swim through, that I first noticed something wasn't quite right. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only the rhythmic thrum of my diesel engine and the hypnotic sweep of my headlights cutting through the humid darkness. I'd been nursing a lukewarm coffee from the last truck stop, trying to shake off the drowsiness that comes with too many miles and not enough sleep, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At first, I figured it was just fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. You spend enough time staring at the road and your mind starts filling in details that aren't there. Shadows that move when they shouldn't, shapes that seem almost alive in the corner of your vision. But when I glanced down at my instrument panel, something made me look twice. The smooth surface of the dashboard seemed different somehow, not quite as uniform as it had been that morning. There were tiny imperfections in the plastic, little bumps and ridges that caught the amber glow of the gauges in ways that cast strange shadows. I rubbed my eyes and took another sip of coffee, chalking it up to road fatigue and the weird way humidity can make everything feel slightly off kilter. The radio was playing some late-night talk show, all conspiracy theories and callers who sounded like they hadn't slept in weeks. So I switched it off and let the engine's steady rumble fill the cab instead. Miles rolled by in that hypnotic way they do on night drives, the yellow lines disappearing under my hood in an endless stream, while my headlights carved tunnels through the darkness ahead. But the feeling wouldn't leave me alone. That sense that something in my familiar cab had shifted, become foreign. Every few minutes my eyes would drift down to the dashboard, and each time those little irregularities in the surface seemed more pronounced. What had been barely visible bumps were becoming definite ridges, rising from the black plastic like tiny mountain ranges. The pattern was strange, almost organic, following curves that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my engine. By midnight I couldn't ignore it anymore. The ridges had grown into distinct raised lines, forming patterns that looked disturbingly familiar but wrong at the same time. They curved and intersected in ways that reminded me of something, though I couldn't quite place what. When I reached over to trace one of the lines with my finger, the surface felt warm, almost body temperature, despite the air conditioning humming steadily in the background. That's when I saw the first tooth. It was small, barely more than a white speck emerging from one of the raised ridges, but unmistakably organic, sharp and pointed like a cat's canine. It jutted up from the dashboard's surface at an angle that caught the gauge lights and threw a tiny shadow across the plastic. I pulled over at the next rest area, a lonely patch of cracked asphalt surrounded by pine trees that whispered secrets in the night breeze, and turned on my cab's interior lights for a better look. What I saw made my coffee turn to acid in my stomach. The entire dashboard was covered in a network of raised lines that looked exactly like gum ridges, complete with that slightly pink coloration you see inside a mouth. And scattered along these ridges, dozens of tiny teeth were pushing through the surface, each one perfectly formed and gleaming wet in the fluorescent light. Some were sharp incisors, others looked like molars, and a few resembled the fangs of something that definitely wasn't human. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at this impossible transformation of my truck's interior, listening to the engine tick as it cooled and the night sounds of Georgia filtering through my slightly open windows. The logical part of my mind kept insisting this was some kind of stress-induced hallucination, that 23 years of irregular sleep and too much caffeine had finally caught up with me. But when I reached out to touch one of the teeth, it was solid and real, slightly warm like living enamel. The really disturbing part was that they seemed to be growing. Every few minutes, new teeth would break through the surface, pushing up from the dashboard like some grotesque garden. The sound they made was barely audible, a soft scratching and clicking that mixed with the normal settling noises of the truck until I couldn't tell which was which. And underneath it all, I swear I could hear something that sounded almost like breathing, a slow rhythmic whisper that seemed to come from the dashboard itself. I tried calling my dispatcher, but the cell signal out there was weaker than sweet tea, giving me nothing but static and the occasional fragment of someone else's conversation. The radio picked up only an emergency broadcast system test that played the same electronic tone over and over until I had to shut it off. Even my satellite navigation system had gone haywire, showing my location as somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. As the night wore on, the teeth continued multiplying and growing larger. Some were now the size of my thumbnail, gleaming white against the pink-tinged ridges that pulsed with what looked increasingly like blood vessels. The worst part was that they seemed to be arranging themselves into something resembling a mouth, forming rows of increasingly large teeth toward what had been the center of my dashboard. The thought of that thing opening, of seeing what lay behind those teeth, made my hands shake as I gripped the steering wheel. I had to get moving. Sitting there in that rest area, surrounded by whispering pines and with my dashboard slowly transforming into something alive and hungry, felt like waiting for disaster. I fired up the engine and pulled back onto the highway, trying to focus on the road ahead instead of the growing collection of teeth just below my line of sight. But driving with that thing inches from my right hand was like trying to ignore a rattlesnake coiled on my kitchen table. The teeth were definitely responding to vibration now. Every time I hit a bump in the road or downshifted for a hill, they would click together in what sounded almost like eating motions. And when I made the mistake of resting my hand on the dashboard while adjusting my mirror, several of the larger teeth actually moved toward my fingers, swiveling in their sockets like they were tracking my movements. That's when I realized the dashboard wasn't just growing teeth randomly. They were forming into a definite mouth shape, complete with what looked like lips beginning to form around the edges. The whole thing was maybe 18 inches across now, taking up most of the dashboard surface and getting more detailed by the hour. I could see what might have been a tongue starting to form in the back, dark and glistening in the gauge lights. Dawn was still hours away when the mouth finally opened. It started as just a crack between the rows of teeth, but slowly widened to reveal a throat that seemed to descend far deeper into my dashboard than should have been physically possible. The breath that emerged was warm and humid, smelling of motor oil and something organic that made my stomach clench. And from somewhere down in those depths came a sound that was part growl, part whisper, and entirely wrong for something made of plastic and metal. The mouth spoke my name. Not my road handle or the name on my commercial license, but the nickname my grandmother used to call me when I was small, something I hadn't heard in decades and had never told another living soul. The voice was soft and almost feminine, but with an undertone that suggested vast spaces and endless hunger. It knew things about me, whispered details of my childhood, my failed marriage, the son I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, secrets I'd never shared with anyone. I floored the accelerator, pushing my truck harder than I ever had, desperate to reach the next town, the next patch of civilization, anywhere with other people who might be able to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But the speedometer needle was spinning wildly, showing impossible readings while my actual speed seemed to remain constant. The mile markers outside my window were repeating, showing the same numbers over and over again the faces in the fuel, from Marcus Henley. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the starless October sky, and I'd been driving my Peterbilt for 16 straight hours when the fuel gauge needle started kissing the red. Highway 287 through Nebraska wasn't exactly known for its abundance of truck stops, but I'd made this run from Denver to Chicago enough times to know there was a lonely little station about 20 miles ahead called Crossroads Fuel. The name always struck me as ominous, though I'd never been able to put my finger on why. The engine's steady rumble had become a lullaby over the past decade of long-haul trucking, but tonight something felt different about the sound. There was an undertone I couldn't quite identify, like a whisper beneath the diesel's throaty growl. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts on the airwaves. The heater hummed softly, fighting against the October chill that seemed determined to seep through every seal and gasket in the old truck. When the neon glow of Crossroads fuel finally appeared on the horizon, I felt an unexpected wave of relief wash over me. The sign flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the empty lot. Only two other vehicles sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of the canopy: an old sedan with rust eating through its wheel wells, and a motorcycle that looked like it hadn't been moved in years. The station itself was one of those classic 1970s designs, all angles and faded colors, with windows that reflected the night more than they revealed what lay within. I pulled my rig up to the diesel pumps and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive after so many hours of mechanical noise. Even the usual sounds you'd expect at a truck stop were missing. No air brakes hissing, no refrigeration units cycling, no other drivers moving about. Just the electric hum of the overhead lights and the distant whistle of wind across the prairie. The fuel nozzle felt heavier than usual in my hands as I began filling the tank. The diesel flowed with its familiar gurgling sound, but as I watched the numbers climb on the pump display, I noticed something peculiar in the fuel itself. At first, I thought it was just the way the harsh lights played across the flowing liquid, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became that there were patterns in the diesel, swirling, shifting patterns that almost looked like faces. I blinked hard and shook my head, chalking it up to road fatigue and too much coffee. But when I looked again, they were still there. Pale, translucent features swimming in the dark fuel, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. An elderly woman with hollow cheeks, a young man with eyes that seemed to follow my gaze, a child whose expression held an impossible sadness. The pump clicked off, startling me back to reality. The faces were gone, leaving only ordinary diesel fuel reflecting the fluorescent lights above. I hung up the nozzle with hands that trembled slightly more than I cared to admit, and made my way into the station to pay. The interior smelled of old cigarette smoke and industrial disinfectant, with an underlying odor I couldn't identify, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. Behind the counter sat a man who looked like he'd been there since the station opened. His skin had the waxy, artificial appearance of someone who spent too much time under fluorescent lights, and his eyes held a peculiar intensity that made me uncomfortable. "That'll be $247, he said in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. His name tag read Earl in faded letters, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed too white, too perfect for someone his age. As I handed over my credit card, I noticed that his fingers were stained with what looked like motor oil, except the color was wrong, too dark with an almost purple tint. "You been driving long tonight?" he asked, running the card through an ancient machine that wheezed and clicked. "Long enough," I replied, trying to keep the conversation brief. Something about Earl made my skin crawl, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. "Fuel's been acting up lately," he said, almost casually. "Customers been seeing things, faces floating around in it. Course that's impossible. Just tricks of the light, you know." His laugh was dry and humorless, like wind through dead leaves. I felt ice form in my stomach. "What kind of faces?" Earl's smile widened, revealing more of those unnaturally perfect teeth. "Oh, all kinds. Happy faces, sad faces, angry faces. Funny thing is, they're always people from around here. People who used to come in regular like before they moved on." The credit card machine finally finished its labored processing, and Earl handed me the receipt with those stained fingers. "You drive safe now," he said. "Road gets mighty lonely this time of night. Easy to see things that ain't there. Easy to become something that ain't quite right." I mumbled my thanks and hurried back to the truck, Earl's words echoing in my mind. The October air felt colder now, cutting through my jacket like it was made of tissue paper. As I climbed into the cab, I caught a glimpse of movement in my side mirror, but when I turned to look directly, There was nothing there except the empty lot and that flickering neon sign. The engine turned over reluctantly, coughing and sputtering before finally catching, but something was wrong with the sound. That whisper I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the engine at all. It was coming from the fuel lines, as if the diesel itself was trying to communicate. I pulled back onto the highway, eager to put distance between myself and Crossroads fuel, but the whispering followed me. Mile after mile it grew clearer, until I could almost make out words. Not quite, but almost, like listening to a conversation in another room. The fuel gauge showed full, but I found myself glancing at it constantly, half expecting to see those faces swimming behind the glass. 50 miles down the road, the whispering became voices. Distinct individual voices, all talking at once in a low murmur that seemed to emanate from every fuel line in the truck. I tried turning up the radio, but it only made static. The CB was dead silent. Not even the distant chatter I'd been hearing all night. That's when I saw her in the side mirror, the elderly woman from the fuel sitting in my passenger seat. Her hollow cheeks were even more pronounced now, and when she turned to look at me, her eyes were the deep brown of diesel fuel. Her mouth moved, but the words that came out were part of the collective whisper filling the cab. "Help us," she said, her voice blending with dozens of others. "We can't leave. Bound to the fuel, bound to the station, bound to the road." More faces appeared, in the mirrors, in the windshield's reflection, in the fuel gauge itself. The young man, the sad child, others I hadn't seen before. All of them speaking in that same whispered chorus, their voices rising and falling like wind through a cemetery. "Earl," the woman continued, her diesel dark eyes never leaving mine. "He's been here so long he forgot what he was before. Feeding on travelers, adding us to his collection. One by one we become part of the fuel, part of the station, part of him." The truck began to slow despite my foot pressing firmly on the accelerator. The fuel gauge needle started dropping impossibly fast, as if something was draining the tank. In the mirrors I could see a dark stain spreading across the highway behind me. Diesel fuel pouring from my tank. But it was moving wrong. Flowing uphill, flowing against the wind, flowing back toward Crossroads fuel like it was being called home. "Turn around," the voices whispered urgently. "Turn around and come back. You're one of us now. The fuel is in your engine, in your lines, in your lungs from breathing the fumes. Turn around and come home." The steering wheel began to turn on its own, fighting against my grip. The truck wanted to make a U-turn, wanted to go back to that flickering neon sign and that man with the stained fingers and perfect teeth. I could feel the pull in my bones, in my blood, a magnetic attraction that was almost impossible to resist. But I'd been driving trucks for 10 years and I knew every trick they could play. I downshifted hard, using the engine brake to slow down while simultaneously yanking the wheel in the opposite direction. The truck lurched and shuddered, but I managed to keep it pointed east, away from Crossroads fuel. The faces in the mirrors screamed, not with their voices, but with the sound of escaping fuel vapor, a high keening that made my ears ring. The exit that never ends. From Marcus Chen. The rhythm of 18 wheels on asphalt has always been my lullaby, the steady thrum of the diesel engine beneath me a heartbeat. I've grown to trust more than my own. 23 years I've been hauling freight across this vast country, and I thought I knew every mile of interstate, every truck stop, every exit ramp from Seattle to Miami. But Highway 287 through Eastern, Colorado proved me wrong on a night when the October wind carried whispers of winter and the kind of loneliness that seeps into your bones. I was running behind schedule, pushing my 14-hour limit with a load of electronics bound for Denver, when the fuel gauge needle started its familiar dance toward empty. The CB radio crackled with static, other drivers warning about construction ahead and a nasty storm system moving in from the west. Lightning flickered on the horizon like a broken fluorescent bulb, and I could smell rain in the air even through the recycled atmosphere of my cab. That's when I spotted exit 127B emerging from the darkness ahead, its green sign illuminated by my headlights. I'd driven this stretch countless times before, but something felt different about the exit tonight. The reflective letters seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality, and the usual landmarks. The abandoned grain elevator, the cluster of cottonwoods, appeared subtly wrong, as if someone had moved them a few degrees off their proper positions. My fuel situation left me no choice. The next truck stop was still 40 miles ahead, and my Detroit diesel was getting thirsty. I downshifted, feeling the familiar compression brake engage, and guided my Peterbilt down the familiar off-ramp. The engine's rumble echoed strangely off the concrete barriers, creating an almost musical resonance that made my teeth ache. The truck stop materialized out of the prairie darkness exactly where it should be, neon signs buzzing and flickering in the humid air. Mel's Travel Plaza, the same peeling paint on the same weathered building I'd stopped at dozens of times before. But as I pulled up to the diesel pumps, something nagged at the edges of my consciousness. The place looked exactly right, yet somehow fundamentally wrong, like a photograph that's been printed as a perfect negative. I shut down the engine, and the sudden silence felt oppressive after hours of mechanical noise. Even the night sound seemed muted. No crickets chirping, no distant traffic, just the whisper of wind through the tall grass surrounding the truck stop. The fluorescent lights above the fuel islands hummed with an electrical intensity that made my skin crawl, casting everything in a harsh, sterile glow that leached the color from the world. Inside the travel plaza, the familiar smell of coffee and fried food should have been comforting, but instead it carried an underlying note of something sour. Something not quite right. Mel himself stood behind the counter. Same gap-toothed smile, same grease-stained apron, same weathered hands that had been making change for truckers for the better part of 3 decades. But when he looked at me, his eyes held a strange quality, as if he was seeing me from a great distance. "Evening, Marcus," he said, his voice carrying the same gravelly tone I remembered, yet somehow hollow, like an echo of itself. "Little late tonight, aren't you?" I nodded, pulling out my wallet to pay for the fuel when something made me pause. The clock on the wall behind Mel read 11:47 p.m., the same time it had been when I'd checked my dashboard before pulling off the highway. But I'd been inside for at least 10 minutes, fumbling with the fuel pump, walking to the building, selecting items from the cooler. Time seemed to be moving strangely, or perhaps not moving at all. "Mel," I said carefully, "what time is it?" His smile never wavered, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Time?" He glanced at the clock, then back at me. "Why, it's 11:47, Marcus. Same as always." The words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Something was deeply wrong here, but I couldn't quite grasp what. I paid for my fuel and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, then hurried back to my truck. The sooner I got back on the highway, the better. But as I fired up the diesel and pulled away from the truck stop, the feeling of wrongness only intensified. The entrance ramp back to Highway 287 seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly into the darkness. My headlights carved a tunnel through the night, but the familiar landmarks remained stubbornly absent. No grain elevator, no cottonwoods, just empty prairie stretching away on both sides. When I finally merged back onto the highway, I checked my GPS, expecting to see the familiar blue line stretching toward Denver. Instead, the screen showed my location as a blinking dot in the middle of nowhere, with no roads, no highways, nothing but blank space. I tapped the screen, thinking it had glitched, but the image remained unchanged. That's when I noticed the mile marker signs. Mile 126, then a 125, then 124. I was traveling in the right direction, but somehow the numbers were counting backward. And ahead in the distance, growing larger with each passing mile, I could see the green glow of an exit sign, exit 127B, the same exit I'd taken less than an hour ago. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a terrible understanding began to dawn. The fuel gauge, which should have been nearly full after my stop, showed 3/4 empty. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m., the exact same time it had been when I'd first spotted the exit. I pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to push past the exit, to break free from whatever strange loop I'd fallen into, but the engine seemed sluggish, unresponsive, as if the truck itself was fighting against my attempts to escape. The exit sign grew larger and larger until it filled my windshield, and despite my best efforts to stay in the left lane, I felt the truck turning, following the familiar curve of the off-ramp whether I wanted to or not. Again, the truck stop appeared out of the darkness. Again, Mel stood behind the counter with his gap-toothed smile. Again, the clock read 11:47 p.m., and again, time refused to move forward. But this time I noticed details that had escaped me before. The other customers in the store, a woman in a faded waitress uniform, an elderly farmer in coveralls, a young man in a military jacket, stood perfectly still, as if frozen between one moment and the next. Their eyes followed me as I moved through the store, but their bodies remained locked in place. "Evening, Marcus," Mel said, his words identical to before. "Little late tonight, aren't you?" This time I didn't answer. Instead, I backed toward the door, panic rising in my throat like bile. But when I reached for the handle, my hand passed through it as if it were made of smoke. I was trapped, caught in some temporal amber that refused to let me leave. For hours, or perhaps minutes, or perhaps years, time had lost all meaning. I struggled against the invisible barriers holding me in that fluorescent-lit purgatory. The other patrons continued their frozen tableau, their eyes the only things that moved, tracking my increasingly frantic attempts to escape. Mel repeated his greeting endlessly, a broken record stuck in an eternal loop. Then, just as despair began to overwhelm me completely, I noticed something new. In the reflection of the front windows, I could see not the truck stop's interior, but the highway beyond. And in that reflection, my truck sat idling at the fuel pumps, exhaust visible in the cold night air. With a clarity born of desperation, I realized the truth. My body was still in the truck, still sitting behind the wheel, but my consciousness had become somehow detached, trapped in this repetitive nightmare. I focused all my will on that reflection, on the image of my Peterbilt waiting in the darkness, and felt something give way like a rubber band snapping. I found myself back in the cab, gasoline-scented night air flowing through the open window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fuel gauge read full, the clock showed 12:13 a.m., and in my rearview mirror I could see Mel's Travel Plaza shrinking into the distance. But as I accelerated back onto Highway 287, heading toward the safety of Denver's distant lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something important behind in that endless loop of time. Even now, months later, I still take a different route through Colorado, because sometimes late at night when the road stretches empty before me, I catch glimpses of exit 127B in my peripheral vision, its green sign flickering like a beacon, patiently waiting for my return. The Salt Road. From Marcus Chen, the CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of an hour when I first heard about the SALT map. I was hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Denver, my 18-wheeler cutting through the desert darkness on Interstate 40, when a voice broke through the white noise like a whisper from another world. The trucker's handle was Phantom Pete, and his words carried the weight of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be explained in polite company. "Any driver heading through Flagstaff tonight, you keep your eyes peeled for the salt stations," Pete's voice wavered through the speaker, distorted by distance and atmospheric interference. "Someone's been drawing maps in the parking lots and they ain't leading nowhere good." I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, the leather warm and familiar beneath my calloused palms. The engine of my Peterbilt hummed its steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that had carried me across thousands of miles of American highway. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly on both sides, painted silver by moonlight and shadows that seemed to move independently of the sparse vegetation casting them. "What kind of maps, Pete?" came another voice, this one belonging to a female driver with the handle Desert Rose. The static grew thicker before Pete responded, his transmission breaking up like fragments of a half-remembered nightmare. Salt, poured out in lines and circles. Looks like roads that don't exist. But they do exist, Rose. They do. The radio fell silent after that, leaving only the ambient sounds of my cab. The low whistle of wind through the slightly cracked passenger window, the rhythmic clicking of my turn signal that I'd forgotten to switch off after passing a slower vehicle miles back, and the distant hum of rubber on asphalt that forms the soundtrack to every long-haul trucker's life. I'd been driving these routes for nearly 15 years, ever since my divorce left me with nothing but a CDL license and a burning need to be anywhere but home. The road had become my sanctuary, the cab of my truck a mobile monastery where I could think, listen to audiobooks, and watch America scroll past my windshield like an endless movie reel. But Pete's transmission had planted something uncomfortable in my mind, a seed of unease that grew larger with each mile marker I passed. The GPS on my dashboard showed Flagstaff still 43 miles ahead, and I found myself studying every truck stop and service station that materialized from the darkness. Most were closed at this hour, their fuel islands dark except for the ghostly glow of automated payment systems and security lights that cast harsh pools of illumination across empty asphalt. But as I approached the outskirts of Flagstaff, I began to notice something unusual. At the first truck stop I passed, a sprawling complex called Desert Oasis that I'd visited dozens of times over the years, there appeared to be something white scattered across the parking area. The overhead lights created enough visibility for me to make out what looked like deliberate patterns, geometric shapes that seemed too organized to be accidental spills or debris. My curiosity warred with an inexplicable sense of dread, but the fuel gauge showing 3/4 full gave me an excuse to keep driving. The second location was a smaller operation, Mom's Kitchen and Fuel, where a hand-painted sign promised the best apple pie in Arizona. Here, too, the parking lot bore strange white markings that gleamed under the sodium vapor lights like bones scattered by some giant hand. The patterns were more elaborate at this stop, featuring intersecting lines that branched and curved with the complexity of a subway system, or perhaps the circulatory system of some massive organism. By the time I reached the third location, my hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without knowing it. This was a truck stop I'd never seen before, which was unusual since I knew this stretch of highway as well as I knew the scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. The sign read simply, "Last Chance Fuel," in letters that seemed to flicker between red and orange, though that might have been a trick of my tired eyes. The parking lot here was almost entirely covered in white substance arranged in patterns so intricate they hurt to look at directly. The design seemed to shift and change as I watched, creating the optical illusion of movement, as if the lines were crawling across the asphalt like living things, despite every instinct screaming at me to keep driving. My fuel gauge had dropped to just under half a tank, and I knew I needed to stop soon or risk running out of diesel in the middle of nowhere. I pulled into the parking lot slowly, my truck's diesel engine rumbling like a wary animal as I navigated between the salt formations. Up close I could see that the white substance was indeed salt, poured and arranged with meticulous precision to create what was unmistakably a map. But it wasn't a map of anywhere I recognized. The roads depicted in salt showed highways that curved impossibly, cities marked by complex circular patterns, and destinations labeled with symbols rather than readable text. The fuel pumps stood like sentinels in the center of the lot, their digital displays glowing green and ready for business despite the late hour. As I climbed down from my cab, the desert air hit me with surprising coolness, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something chemical and sharp that made my nose wrinkle. The salt crunched under my boots as I walked to the fuel island, each step disturbing the carefully arranged patterns and leaving dark footprints in the white crystalline landscape. While my tank filled, I found myself studying the salt map more carefully. The level of detail was extraordinary, showing not just major highways but smaller roads, rest areas, way stations, and what appeared to be truck stops marked with distinctive symbols. Some locations were marked with simple circles, others with elaborate geometric designs that seemed to pulse and writhe in my peripheral vision. Most unsettling were the areas marked with what looked like warning symbols, jagged lines and sharp angles that conveyed danger even without accompanying text. The fuel pump clicked off, startling me from my examination of the otherworldly cartography. As I replaced the nozzle and secured my fuel cap, I noticed that one section of the salt map seemed to be moving. The lines were shifting and rearranging themselves slowly but visibly, like time-lapse footage of growing plants or flowing water. The movement centered on what appeared to be my current location, marked with a symbol that looked disturbingly like a truck. I hurried back to my cab, but as I reached for the door handle, I realized that the moving section of the map was expanding. Lines of salt were flowing across the asphalt like liquid, creating new roads and intersections that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. The symbol marking my location began to move as well, following one of the newly formed salt roads that led away from the truck stop and into the desert. The rational part of my mind insisted that wind was disturbing the salt, creating the illusion of purposeful movement, but the night air was perfectly still, and the patterns were changing with too much precision to be random. As I watched in growing horror, the moving truck symbol on the salt map began to accelerate, following a route that led to one of the areas marked with warning symbols. I yanked open my cab door and hauled myself inside, my hands shaking as I turned the key and brought the big diesel engine roaring to life. The headlights illuminated the salt map spread before me, and I could see that the moving patterns had created a clear path leading from the fuel island to the parking lot exit, but it wasn't the same exit I'd used to enter. This new route led toward a section of the lot that had been empty when I arrived, but now showed what appeared to be a road leading directly into the desert. As I put the truck in gear and began to move, I realized with mounting terror that I was following the path laid out in salt. Every attempt to steer toward the familiar exit I'd used to enter the lot was met with resistance, as if invisible barriers were guiding me along the predetermined route. The salt lines on either side of my truck began to glow with a faint phosphorescent light, creating a corridor of pale illumination that stretched ahead into the darkness. The CB radio crackled to life as I cleared the parking lot, and Pete's voice emerged from the static once again. "Marcus, if you're hearing this, you need to throw your truck in reverse and get back to the interstate. Don't follow the salt road no matter what it shows you." "Pete, how do you know my name?" I managed to respond, though my voice came out as a croak. "I never gave my handle." "Because I can see your truck symbol moving on the map," Pete replied, his transmission clearer now despite the impossibility of that statement. "I'm looking at a salt map in Albuquerque, and it's showing positions of every truck on the road. You're heading towards something that ain't on any official map, son." I looked in my mirrors and felt my heart skip a beat. The truck stop behind me was gone, replaced by empty desert that stretched to the horizon under a star-filled sky. The frequency of fear. For Marcus Kane, the CB radio had been counting backwards from 10,000 for 3 days straight, and I was starting to think I might be losing my mind out here on the endless stretch of Highway 287 through eastern Colorado. "My name is Marcus Kane, and I've been hauling freight across these lonely American highways for the better part of 2 decades. But I've never encountered anything quite like what started happening last Tuesday, when I picked up that old Cobra 29 from a truck stop in Amarillo. The previous owner had left it sitting on the counter next to the register with a note that simply read, "Free to good home," scrawled in shaky handwriting. The clerk, a weathered man with oil-stained fingers and eyes that seemed to look right through you, just shrugged when I asked about it and said the trucker who'd left it claimed it was picking up signals from channels that didn't exist. I should have taken that as a warning, but money had been tight lately, and my old radio had been acting up for weeks, filling my cab with nothing but static, and the occasional snippet of some late-night AM station playing songs that sounded like they'd been recorded underwater. The installation was simple enough, just a matter of switching out the old unit and running the coaxial cable to the antenna mounted on my Peterbilt's roof. The first day, everything worked perfectly normal. I chatted with other drivers about road conditions and speed traps, listened to the usual chatter about fuel prices and dispatcher complaints that forms the constant background soundtrack of life on the road. But that evening, as I was pulling into a rest stop outside of Lyman, Colorado, something changed. It started as a small voice, barely audible beneath the ambient noise of diesel engines and highway traffic, filtering through my partially open windows. At first I thought it might be a child playing with their parents' radio, counting numbers in that slow, deliberate way kids do when they're practicing their arithmetic. 9,998, the voice said, clear as a bell on channel 19. 9,997. The voice was young, probably no more than 10 or 11 years old, but there was something unsettling about its mechanical precision, each number enunciated with the same exact rhythm and inflection. I keyed the microphone and called out, asking if there was a little one on the channel who might have gotten hold of Daddy's radio, but the counting continued without interruption. 9,995, 9,994. Other truckers were starting to chatter about it too, some annoyed by the interference, others curious about where the transmission might be originating. A driver with the handle Desert Rose mentioned that she'd been hearing the same counting for the past hour, following her westbound on Interstate 40. Another voice, gravelly and tired, said he'd picked up the signal somewhere outside of Oklahoma City and couldn't seem to tune it out no matter which channel he switched to. That night, I parked at a Flying J and tried to get some sleep, but the voice continued its relentless countdown even with the CB turned down to barely audible levels. The sound seemed to seep through the walls of my sleeper berth, mixing with the ambient noise of idling engines and the distant hum of highway traffic. 9,923, 9,922. I found myself lying there in the dark, unconsciously anticipating each number, my mind trying to calculate how long it would take to reach zero at this pace. The mathematics were disturbing. At roughly one number every 10 seconds, it would take more than a day to complete the countdown, assuming it had started from 10,000. The second day brought an overcast sky and the promise of storm clouds building along the western horizon. I had a delivery to make in Denver, so I pulled back onto the highway, with the voice still counting away in the background of my morning routine. 9,871, 9,870. Coffee tasted bitter in my mouth as I tried to focus on the road ahead. But that steady countdown had wormed its way into my consciousness like a song you can't get out of your head. I started catching myself silently mouthing along with the numbers, and had to physically shake my head to break the hypnotic rhythm. The really unsettling thing was how other drivers were beginning to react to the phenomenon. During my usual check-ins on Channel 19, conversations kept circling back to the counting. A driver named Tommy mentioned that his dispatcher had received calls from truckers as far away as Montana and New Mexico, all reporting the same young voice counting backwards on their radios. The signal seemed to be getting stronger too, bleeding through onto other channels and sometimes overpowering local transmissions. Even switching to Channel 9 or the alternate frequencies didn't provide any relief. The voice followed, patient and persistent, never wavering in its mechanical precision. By afternoon, I'd made my delivery and was heading back east toward Kansas when the storm clouds finally opened up, sending sheets of rain across my windshield and turning the highway into a ribbon of reflected light. The rhythmic sound of my wipers seemed to synchronize with the countdown, creating an hypnotic backdrop that made it increasingly difficult to maintain focus on driving. 9,612. 9,611. The voice had become part of the landscape now, as constant and unremarkable as my engine's rumble or the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. That's when I started noticing the time discrepancies. According to my dashboard clock, I'd been driving for 3 hours since leaving Denver, but my logbook suggested it had been closer to 5. The digital display on my CB radio was flickering between different times, sometimes showing numbers that didn't correspond to any recognizable format. When I stopped at a truck stop to fuel up and grab dinner, the clerk looked at me strangely and asked if I was feeling all right. She said I'd been standing at the counter for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word, just staring at the radio mounted behind the register with an expression she described as, "not quite there." The third day brought clear skies but no relief from the countdown, which had progressed into the 9,500s and showed no signs of slowing down or stopping. I'd begun to notice other changes too. My CB seemed to be picking up fragments of conversations that didn't quite make sense, voices discussing routes through cities I'd never heard of, and references to truck stops that didn't appear on any map or GPS system I could find. Sometimes the counting voice would pause for a few seconds, and during those brief silences, I could hear what sounded like distant traffic, engine noise, and the unmistakable squeak of worn brake shoes, as if the transmission was originating from inside another truck cab somewhere out on the endless highway. The most disturbing development came that evening as I was approaching the Colorado-Kansas border. The counting had reached 9,200 and something when suddenly the young voice spoke directly to me, breaking from its numerical pattern for the first time in 3 days. "Hello, Marcus," it said, using the same mechanical intonation but somehow managing to inject a note of recognition that made my blood run cold. "Thank you for helping with the count. We're almost ready now." Then, without missing a beat, it resumed the countdown as if nothing had happened. I grabbed the microphone with trembling hands and keyed it repeatedly, demanding to know who was speaking and how they knew my name, but the only response was the continued progression of numbers. Other drivers on the channel were asking if I was all right, saying they'd heard me shouting but couldn't make out what I was trying to communicate. When I asked if they'd heard the voice address me by name, they seemed confused. Tommy, who'd been following the countdown phenomenon from the beginning, swore that the voice had never deviated from counting, not even for a second. That night, sleep became impossible. The countdown continued its relentless progression, now in the 9,100s, and I found myself completely unable to tune it out or think about anything else. Every number felt like a footstep approaching through a dark hallway, each digit bringing whatever was going to happen at 0 that much closer to reality. I tried disconnecting the CB radio entirely, but somehow the voice continued, seeming to emanate from the very walls of my truck cab. Even with my engine off and the electrical system shut down, that patient young voice kept counting, growing clearer and more distinct as the numbers grew smaller. The fourth morning brought a revelation that shattered any remaining hope I had of rational explanation. When I checked my logbook and compared it with my GPS history, I discovered that I'd been driving the same 100-mile stretch of highway for 3 days straight, somehow ending up back at the same truck stops and rest areas without ever consciously turning around or changing course. According to my fuel receipts, I'd purchased diesel at the same Flying J in Lyman, Colorado, multiple times, but I had no memory of making those stops or any awareness that I was traveling in circles. The countdown was in the 8,900s now, and other truckers were reporting increasingly strange experiences. Desert Rose called in to say that she'd lost 2 days somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, with no memory of the time. The cargo that multiplied. From Jake Morrison, the manifest said 47 crates of laboratory equipment bound for Denver. Nothing more complicated than microscopes and specimen containers according to the paperwork. But I should have known better when they loaded my trailer at 3 in the morning, with no dock lights and men who wouldn't meet my eyes. 23 years hauling freight across this country, and you develop instincts about certain loads, about certain shippers who prefer the darkness and pay in cash without asking questions about your logbooks or rest periods. The Peterbilt's diesel engine settled into its familiar rhythm as I pulled away from the industrial complex outside Bakersfield, the weight distribution feeling solid and proper behind me. 40,000 pounds of scientific equipment riding smooth on the interstate as I climbed into the Sierra Nevada foothills. The night was clear and cold. Stars scattered like broken glass across the windshield, and I had the CB radio turned low, catching fragments of conversation from other drivers pushing through the mountain passes. My coffee was still hot in the thermos, the heater humming steadily, and everything felt normal until I stopped for my mandatory break at a truck stop near Barstow and walked back to check my load securement. The trailer doors were still sealed with the special locks they'd provided, heavy industrial padlocks with no keys, just combination wheels they'd spun closed before I left. But there was a sound coming from inside, a very faint scratching that could have been cargo shifting or something else entirely. I pressed my ear against the cold aluminum door and listened, hearing what might have been movement, a soft rustling like papers being shuffled or small objects being rearranged. The scratching came again, rhythmic and deliberate, and I found myself counting the intervals between sounds, trying to determine if there was a pattern. 3 scratches, pause, 5 scratches, pause, 3 again. It reminded me of something alive in there, something trying to communicate or escape. But that was impossible because laboratory equipment doesn't move on its own, doesn't make those kinds of sounds no matter how the trailer rocks on its suspension. Back in the cab, I tried to focus on the road ahead, on the familiar routine of checking mirrors and monitoring the engine gauges, but the scratching had unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. The load felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the trailer was carrying more weight than when I'd left California. The Peterbilt was working harder, the turbo whistling more than usual on the grades, and my fuel consumption was running higher than it should have been for the stated cargo weight. When I stopped to fuel outside Flagstaff, I walked the perimeter of the trailer again, checking for damage or signs that someone had tampered with the locks, but everything appeared secure. The scratching was louder now, coming from multiple locations along the trailer walls, and there was a new sound underneath it, a very soft chittering like insects communicating in a language I couldn't understand. I told myself it was my imagination, that long hauls in the dark hours play tricks on the mind, create phantom sounds and false perceptions that seem completely real until morning comes and reveals their impossibility. But when I climbed back into the cab and called dispatch on the satellite unit to report my progress, the woman on the other end asked about cargo condition, with an urgency that made me wonder what she knew about this load that wasn't on the manifest. The interstate stretched ahead through New Mexico darkness, empty except for occasional headlights in the distance, and I found myself checking the trailer more frequently than necessary, adjusting my mirrors to keep watch on the load I was hauling. The scratching had evolved into something more complex, patterns of sound that seemed to repeat themselves in sequences, as if whatever was making the noise was learning, adapting, becoming more organized with each passing mile. There were definite rhythms now, communication patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random movement of inanimate objects. Near the Colorado border, I pulled into a rest area to check my logbook and take a mandatory rest break, but sleep was impossible with the sounds coming from the trailer. The chittering had grown louder and more varied, joined by other noises that I couldn't identify, soft clicking sounds and what might have been very quiet vocalizations, too faint to be certain but persistent enough to keep me alert and anxious. When I walked around the trailer with a flashlight, I noticed that the aluminum sides were warm to the touch despite the cold mountain air, as if something inside was generating heat, metabolizing, consuming energy and producing waste heat like living organisms. The locks were still secure, the seals unbroken, but when I pressed my ear against different sections of the trailer wall, I could hear distinct activity zones, areas where the sounds were concentrated and organized, suggesting that whatever was inside had learned to work together, to coordinate their movements and communications. The original 47 crates had somehow become something more complex, something that defied the manifest description and challenged my understanding of what laboratory equipment should sound like. During transport, dawn was breaking over the Colorado plains when I finally reached the delivery address in Denver, A modern warehouse complex that looked nothing like a scientific research facility. The men who met me were the same type who had loaded the trailer in California. Efficient and silent, working with the same practiced movements of people who handled unusual cargo on a regular basis. When they opened the trailer doors, I caught a brief glimpse inside before they blocked my view. But what I saw didn't match the manifest description of 47 crates of laboratory equipment. The trailer was packed with hundreds of containers, small plastic boxes stacked floor to ceiling, far more than could have fit when I left California. Each container had ventilation holes drilled in the sides and what appeared to be feeding tubes attached to automated dispensing systems that hadn't been part of the original load. The chittering sound was overwhelming now, coming from every container. A symphony of communication from whatever specimens were being transported across the country in unmarked trailers by drivers who asked no questions and kept no detailed records of what they hauled. They paid me in cash as promised, and sent me on my way with another load heading back toward California. But I couldn't stop thinking about those extra containers, about how 47 crates had become hundreds of smaller units during the 3-day journey across 4 states. The manifest for my return load said agricultural supplies, but I could already hear the familiar scratching starting up again before I reached the interstate, and this time I knew better than to check my cargo too closely or ask questions about sounds that shouldn't exist. The Peterbilt rolls through the night carrying loads I don't fully understand, hauling freight that changes during transport, multiplying and evolving in ways that challenge everything I thought I knew about cargo and shipping regulations. The dispatchers pay well for discretion, for drivers willing to haul unusual loads without asking questions or filing detailed reports, and I keep telling myself that ignorance is safer than knowledge when it comes to certain types of freight that breed during transport. Sometimes, I wonder what would happen if one of those trailers broke down in a remote location, if the temperature control systems failed, or the feeding mechanisms malfunctioned during a long haul across empty desert highways. But mostly I just drive, listening to the sounds from the trailer behind me, counting the scratches and chittering vocalizations, and trying not to think about how many containers there might be by the time I reach my destination, the Crimson Crossing. From Marcus, the old Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I guided her through the winding mountain roads of eastern Kentucky, my CB crackling softly with distant chatter from other drivers navigating the lonesome highways. It was well past midnight, and the autumn fog had settled thick between the hills like cotton batting, making my headlights feel more like candles in a cathedral than proper illumination. I'd been driving these routes for nearly 20 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment, but tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. The load I was carrying wasn't anything special, just a shipment of medical supplies bound for a hospital in Lexington. But the dispatcher had seemed unusually eager to get it moving, offering me double pay to take the night run through what he called the scenic route. I should have known better than to trust Danny's definition of scenic, especially when it came with dollar signs attached. But the extra money would help cover my daughter's college tuition, and I'd driven through worse conditions in my time behind the wheel. The fog grew thicker as I climbed higher into the mountains, my CB picking up nothing but static and the occasional fragment of a trucker's song drifting in from some distant station. The road had narrowed to barely 2 lanes with guardrails that looked like they hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration, and I found myself hunching forward over the steering wheel, straining to see beyond the feeble reach of my headlights. That's when I first caught sight of the bridge ahead, its dark silhouette emerging from the mist like something out of a fever dream. It was an old stone arch bridge, the kind they don't build anymore, with moss-covered walls that rose from a deep gorge I couldn't see the bottom of. The architecture felt wrong for this part of Kentucky, too European somehow, as if someone had plucked it from the Scottish Highlands and dropped it into the Appalachian wilderness. There were no warning signs, no historical markers, nothing to indicate its age or origin. just this ancient crossing spanning a chasm that seemed to swallow sound itself. As I approached, my headlight swept across the bridge's surface, and I noticed something that made me ease off the accelerator. The stone appeared to be stained, darkened in long streaks that ran from the center line toward the edges like water marks, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate to be natural weathering. I rolled down my window, letting the cool mountain air fill the cab, and caught a scent that reminded me of the butcher shop my grandfather used to run, metallic and rich and somehow alive. The Kenworth's engine note changed as we reached the bridge approach, dropping to a lower register that seemed to resonate through the stone structure itself. I could feel the vibration in my chest, a deep thrumming that made my teeth ache and sent shivers down my spine despite the truck's warm interior. The CB suddenly burst to life with a voice I didn't recognize, gravelly and distant, speaking words I couldn't quite make out over the static, as if someone was trying to warn me about something just beyond my understanding. I brought the truck to a stop at the bridge's entrance, letting the engine idle while I studied the crossing ahead. The stains on the stone were more pronounced now, and in the shifting light of my headlamps, they almost seemed to glisten, as if they were wet despite the dry night air. A small sign mounted on a rusted post caught my attention, so weathered and faded that I had to squint to make out the words, "Sorrow Bridge, built 1847, cross at your own risk." The warning should have been enough to make me turn around, find another route, but the narrow road offered no place to safely maneuver a 40-foot trailer, and backing down the mountain in this fog would be suicide. Besides, I told myself, trying to rationalize the growing unease in my gut, it was probably just some local folklore, a ghost story concocted to spook tourists and keep teenagers from using the bridge as a party spot. I eased the truck forward, feeling the transition from asphalt to stone as my tires made contact with the bridge deck. The sensation was immediate and unmistakable, a wetness that seemed to seep through the rubber and metal, reaching up into the cab itself. My hands gripping the steering wheel felt suddenly slick, and when I glanced down, I saw what looked like dark liquid coating my palms, though I knew I hadn't touched anything that could cause such staining. The Kenworth's wipers activated on their own, sweeping across a windshield that had suddenly become streaked with something thick and red, something that smeared rather than cleared, leaving long crimson trails that pulsed in rhythm with my own heartbeat. The metallic scent grew stronger, filling the cab with its cloying sweetness, and I could taste copper on my tongue as if I'd bitten down hard enough to draw blood from my own mouth. Halfway across the bridge, the truck began to slow despite my foot remaining steady on the accelerator, as if the stone itself was somehow resisting our passage. The engine labored against an invisible force, RPMs climbing while our forward progress diminished to a crawl. Through the blood-streaked windshield, I could see the far end of the bridge wavering like a mirage, sometimes appearing close enough to touch, other times seeming miles away through the thickening fog. The CB crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer, closer, speaking in a tone that carried the weight of countless sorrows. "Every crossing demands payment," it said, the words seeming to come from the bridge itself rather than the radio speaker. "Every passage leaves a mark. Welcome to Sorrow Bridge, driver. Welcome to the place where the road remembers." I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperation overriding caution, as the Kenworth's diesel roared its defiance into the night. The blood on the windshield grew thicker, completely obscuring my forward vision, forcing me to navigate by memory and instinct alone. I could feel the trailer beginning to sway behind me, as if something was pulling at it, trying to drag the entire rig sideways toward the bridge's low stone walls. The taste of copper intensified until I was gagging, fighting the urge to vomit as my vision began to blur around the edges. My hands were completely crimson now, the steering wheel slippery beneath my grip, and I could see dark stains spreading across my shirt, across the truck's interior, as if the very air inside the cab had become saturated with something that defied explanation. Just when I thought the bridge would claim both me and my rig, I felt the front wheels transition back onto asphalt. The sensation so sudden and jarring that I nearly lost control. The Kenworth lurched forward as if released from invisible chains, the engine's note returning to normal as we cleared the far end of the crossing. I slammed on the brakes, bringing us to a shuddering stop on solid ground, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I sat there for several minutes, hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. The windshield was crystal clear now. No trace of the crimson streaks that had blinded me moments before. My hands were clean, unmarked by any staining, and the metallic scent had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Even the CB had returned to its normal static, no mysterious voices offering cryptic warnings about payment and passage. When I finally worked up the courage to check my mirrors, looking back toward the bridge we'd just crossed, I saw only empty road disappearing into the fog. Sorrow Bridge was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, leaving nothing but questions, and the lingering taste of copper that would haunt me for weeks to come. I drove the rest of the night in silence, delivering my load on schedule. But I never took that mountain route again. Sometimes late at night when I'm fighting sleep on a long haul, I wonder if other drivers have found that bridge, if they've felt their truck slow as they crossed its blood-stained stones, if they've paid whatever price the crossing demands. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself wondering if I actually made it across at all, or if I'm still out there in the fog, still crossing, still bleeding into the phantom freight. From Marcus Chen. The first thing they tell you in long-haul trucking is to document everything. Every mile, every fuel stop, every load secured or delivered. Insurance companies love their paperwork, and a single photo can mean the difference between getting paid and getting sued. I'd been running freight across the Midwest for 15 years when I learned that some things refuse to be documented. No matter how real they seem rolling down that endless ribbon of asphalt beside you. It started on a humid August night somewhere between Council Bluffs and Des Moines, the kind of evening where the air sits heavy as wet wool and the heat shimmer never quite fades even after sunset. I was hauling a load of electronics westbound, my Peterbilt 379 humming steady at 65, when I first noticed the other truck in my mirrors. Not unusual in itself, these highways see plenty of night traffic, but something about this one caught my attention and held it like a fishhook. The truck appeared to be an old Kenworth, maybe from the 70s, with a long conventional hood and twin exhaust stacks that threw off just enough chrome to catch my LED running lights. It maintained perfect distance behind me, maybe 100 yards back, never gaining, never falling behind. The driver seemed professional enough, keeping proper following distance. But in all my years on the road, I'd developed an instinct for the rhythm of traffic, and this truck felt different somehow. It moved too smoothly, too perfectly, like it was riding on rails instead of rubber. After an hour of watching those headlights in my mirror, I decided to test my suspicions. I eased off the throttle, dropping from 65 to 60, expecting the Kenworth to signal and pass. Instead, it slowed with me, maintaining that exact same distance. I tried speeding up to 70, then 75. The truck matched my speed effortlessly, never wavering from its position. The behavioral pattern reminded me of those old stories about phantom hitchhikers, except this ghost seemed to drive an 18-wheeler. At the next truck stop, a sprawling travel center with islands of harsh fluorescent light carved out of the prairie darkness, I pulled in to fuel up and grab some coffee. The Kenworth followed me into the lot but didn't stop at the fuel islands. Instead, it continued to the far end of the parking area where the night shadows pooled deepest between the overhead lights. I could see its silhouette, dark and angular, but couldn't make out any details of the cab or the driver inside. Professional curiosity got the better of me. I've always been one to document interesting rigs, and this old Kenworth had the classic lines that you don't see much anymore. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos across the parking lot. the flash illuminating the rows of sleeping trucks between us. The image on my screen showed the travel center clearly. The other parked trucks, even the light poles and the distant tree line, but where the Kenworth should have been sitting, there was nothing but empty asphalt. I stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked up at the truck itself, still visible in the shadows, solid as steel and chrome, exhaust stacks pointing at the star-scattered sky. I took another photo, this time without the flash, letting the phone's night mode work its digital magic. Same result. The truck simply wasn't there in the image, as if the camera was looking through it to the pavement beyond. A chill ran down my spine despite the muggy heat. I'd heard stories in truck stops and diners, tales that drivers swapped like trading cards during mandatory rest breaks. Ghost trucks on empty highways, phantom rigs that appeared in mirrors but cast no shadows. I'd always filed those stories away with UFO sightings and Bigfoot encounters, the kind of nonsense that emerges from too much coffee and too little sleep. Standing there in that fluorescent-washed parking lot, staring at photos that denied what my eyes could plainly see, I began to reconsider my skepticism. Back on the highway, the Kenworth fell in behind me again as if nothing had happened. I tried the CB radio, scanning through the channels, hoping to raise the other driver. Static answered me, broken occasionally by distant conversations between other truckers, but Channel 19, the one every professional monitors, remained stubbornly quiet. I called out my position, described the Kenworth, asked if anyone else could see the truck following me. A driver deadheading back to Chicago confirmed my position, but said the highway behind me looked empty from his vantage point on an overpass. The night stretched on, mile markers clicking past in steady rhythm, and the phantom truck maintained its vigil in my mirrors. I found myself checking those mirrors more frequently than necessary, some primitive part of my brain insisting that something about this situation was deeply wrong. The truck's headlights never seemed to dim or brighten with the natural variations of electrical systems. They burned steady and white, like stars that had fallen too close to Earth. Near midnight, somewhere in the rolling hills east of Omaha, I decided to document what was happening more thoroughly. If I was losing my mind, at least there would be evidence. If something genuinely supernatural was occurring, someone needed to record it. I set my phone to video mode and propped it against the windshield, letting it capture the view through my rear window. The Kenworth appeared clearly in the live image on the screen, but when I stopped recording and played back the footage, the highway behind me was empty except for the occasional passing of other traffic. That's when I noticed something else. In the video playback, other trucks appeared and disappeared normally as they passed, their lights sweeping across the frame in realistic arcs. But during the times when I knew the phantom Kenworth was directly behind me, those passing trucks seemed to flicker or distort slightly, as if the camera was struggling to process something it couldn't quite see. The audio track picked up the normal sounds of highway travel. My engine, the whisper of wind over the cab, the Doppler shift of passing traffic, but no additional engine noise from the truck that should have been following mere yards behind. Dawn was still hours away when I made a decision that went against every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of professional driving. I pulled over at a rest area, one of those simple affairs with just picnic tables and restrooms, no commercial facilities. If this phantom truck was following me specifically, I wanted to see what would happen when I stopped moving. The Kenworth pulled in behind me, parking perhaps 50 yards away near the entrance to the rest area. Its engine should have been audible from that distance, the characteristic rumble of a big diesel at idle, but the night air carried only the sound of crickets and the distant whisper of traffic on the main highway. I climbed down from my cab and walked slowly toward the other truck, my footsteps loud on the cracked asphalt. The closer I got, the more details I should have been able to make out, but somehow the Kenworth seemed to resist examination. It remained frustratingly indistinct, as if I was viewing it through layers of heat shimmer or underwater distortion. I could see that it was definitely an older model, probably from the mid-70s based on the proportions and hood length. but specifics like license plates, company markings, or even the condition of the paint remained stubbornly unclear. When I was perhaps 20 feet away, I raised my phone again, this time activating the flashlight function while recording video. The LED beam swept across the truck's cab, and for just an instant I thought I saw something in the driver's seat. Not quite a person, but a shape that suggested human presence, darker than the shadows around it. Then the beam seemed to pass through the windshield without reflecting, as if the glass wasn't really there, and the impression of occupancy faded like smoke. I tried calling out, asking if the driver needed assistance, but my voice seemed to fall flat in the humid air, absorbed by something that shouldn't have been there. The truck sat silent, no response from within, no indication that anyone had heard me. I took several more photos and video clips, documenting the phantom from different angles, but I already knew what the results would show. Empty parking spaces, vacant asphalt, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. The walk back to my Peterbilt felt longer than it should have, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, though I wasn't sure what I expected to see. The Kenworth remained where it was, patient as a predator, waiting for me to continue our strange procession down the highway. Part of me wanted to stay at the rest area until sunrise, to see if daylight would reveal the truth about my mysterious companion. But I had a delivery schedule to maintain and a reputation to protect. Back on the road, the Phantom resumed its position behind me with mechanical precision. The miles rolled by in hypnotic succession, broken yellow lines strobing past like a countdown to something I couldn't name. I tried focusing on normal things, my route planning, fuel calc, the midnight service. From Jake Morrison. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours when I first spotted the neon glow cutting through the darkness ahead. My Peterbilt's wipers beat their familiar rhythm against the windshield, and the diesel engine hummed its steady tune beneath me as I navigated the winding mountain highway through eastern Oregon. It was well past midnight, and I'd been driving since sunrise, hauling a load of lumber from Seattle to Denver. The CB radio had gone quiet hours ago, leaving me alone with nothing but the storm and the hypnotic sweep of my headlights across the wet asphalt. The diner appeared gradually through the rain-blurred windshield, its red and blue neon sign flickering like a lighthouse beacon in the mountain darkness. Millie's All-Night Diner, the sign proclaimed, though some of the letters sputtered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the empty parking lot. The building itself was a classic silver-sided rail car design, the kind you'd find alongside highways built in the 50s, when America was young and optimistic, and every road led somewhere worth going. Steam rose from its small windows, promising warmth and coffee, and maybe a slice of pie to chase away the chill that had been seeping into my bones for the last 100 miles. I pulled my rig into the gravel lot, the air brakes hissing as I brought the big truck to a stop. The rain drummed against the sleeper cab's roof with increasing intensity, and I could hear the wind picking up in the tall pines that surrounded the diner on 3 sides. Through my side window, I could see warm light spilling from the diner's windows, and the promise of human contact after hours of solitary driving was too appealing to resist. I grabbed my wallet and baseball cap, pulled on my jacket, and stepped down from the cab into the cold mountain air. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to the diner's front door, rain pattering against my shoulders and the brim of my cap. As I approached the entrance, I noticed something odd about the windows. Though light poured through them, creating golden rectangles on the wet gravel, I couldn't make out any figures inside. No silhouettes of late-night diners hunched over coffee cups. No movement of staff behind the counter. Just that steady, inviting glow that seemed to promise warmth and sustenance. A small bell chimed as I pushed through the glass door, and immediately I was enveloped by the familiar atmosphere of an all-night diner. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and bacon grease, fried onions, and fresh bread. A vintage jukebox glowed softly in the corner, though no music played. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, their surfaces worn smooth by countless travelers, and a long counter ran the length of the far wall, backed by a kitchen pass-through window that revealed stainless steel surfaces gleaming under fluorescent lights. But the diner was empty. Not just empty of customers, which wouldn't have been unusual at this hour in this remote location, but empty of staff as well. The coffee pots on their warmers were full and steaming, fresh and aromatic. The grill in the kitchen hissed quietly, as if someone had just been cooking. A half-filled coffee cup sat on the counter, still warm to the touch when I tentatively reached out to test it, steam rising lazily from its dark surface. The cash register was open, bills and coins neatly arranged in their compartments. I called out a greeting, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space. "Hello? Anyone here?" The only response was the gentle bubbling of the coffee makers and the soft hum of the refrigerated display case, its glass shelves lined with pies and cakes that looked freshly made. Apple, cherry, chocolate cream, their surfaces perfect and unblemished, as if they had just emerged from the oven. Despite the oddness of the situation, I found myself sliding onto one of the red vinyl stools at the counter. The warmth of the diner was seeping into my rain-dampened clothes, and the smell of fresh coffee was making my mouth water. I'd driven nearly 600 miles since my last real break, and my body was crying out for caffeine and food. Perhaps the staff had simply stepped into the back room. Or maybe this was one of those honor system places where travelers left money on the counter and served themselves. As I sat there debating whether to help myself to coffee, I heard the soft clink of ceramic against formica. I looked down to find a steaming mug of coffee sitting directly in front of me, black and strong, exactly how I preferred it. The mug hadn't been there moments before, I was certain of that, but there it was, the coffee surface rippling slightly as if it had just been set down. I looked around the diner again, searching for whoever had served me, but I remained completely alone. The coffee was perfect, rich and hot with just the right amount of bitterness. As I sipped it, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps I'd been more tired than I realized. Maybe I'd dozed off for a moment and someone had come out to serve me while I wasn't fully alert. Fatigue could play tricks on a driver's mind, especially after long hours on dark highways. But then I heard it, the soft scrape of a plate being placed on the counter beside my coffee cup. I looked down to find a slice of apple pie, the crust golden brown and flaky with vanilla ice cream melting slowly alongside it. The plate was warm and I could smell cinnamon and nutmeg, butter, and caramelized apples. A fork lay beside the plate, its surface reflecting the diner's fluorescent lights. This time I was certain I hadn't dozed off. I had been fully awake, fully alert, staring directly at the empty counter space where the pie now sat. Yet there it was, as real and tangible as the coffee mug in my hands. My heart began to beat a little faster, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up despite the diner's warmth. I stood up slowly from the stool and backed away from the counter, my eyes scanning the empty diner. The kitchen pass-through window was dark now, though I was sure it had been lit when I first entered. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper somehow, more substantial, as if they contained shapes that my eyes couldn't quite resolve into recognizable forms. That's when I noticed them. Subtle movements in my peripheral vision, like the suggestion of figured moving just beyond the edge of sight. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, but I could sense activity all around me. The soft whisper of footsteps on linoleum, the gentle clink of dishes being moved, the almost inaudible rustle of fabric, as if someone in a uniform was walking past just out of view. The diner was serving itself, or rather, being served by staff that existed just beyond the boundaries of human perception. I could feel their presence now, a subtle shift in the air as they moved around me, tending to their eternal duties in this way station between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. They weren't malevolent, these invisible waitstaff, just dedicated to their work in a way that death itself couldn't interrupt. I reached slowly for my wallet, my hands trembling slightly as I placed several bills on the counter beside the untouched pie. The money felt inadequate somehow, too mundane a currency for this transaction between the living and the unseen. But as I set the bills down, they vanished instantly, as if invisible fingers had whisked them away to some otherworldly cash register. The front door seemed impossibly far away as I backed toward it, my eyes never leaving the empty dining room where I now sensed a dozen invisible figures going about their nightly routine, cleaning tables that appeared spotless, refilling coffee cups that never seemed to empty, taking orders from customers who existed only in memory and shadow. The bell chimed again as I pushed through the door and stumbled out into the rain, my heart pounding against my ribs. The cold mountain air hit my face like a slap, shocking me back to the reality of the storm and the darkness and my truck waiting in the gravel lot. I ran through the rain to my Peterbilt, my boots splashing through puddles as I fumbled with the door handle. Once inside the cab, I sat for several minutes trying to calm my breathing and make sense of what had just happened. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could still see the diner glowing in the darkness, its windows warm and inviting. But now I thought I could make out shapes moving inside, shadows that suggested activity just beyond clear perception. I started the engine and pulled out of the gravel lot, my headlights sweeping across the diner one last time before I rejoined the highway. In my mirrors, I watched the neon sign grow smaller and dimmer until it was swallowed entirely by the mountain darkness. For the next 50 miles, I couldn't stop thinking about that coffee and pie still sitting on the counter. The Silent Chorus. From Marcus Chen. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon, unmarked by anything but the occasional reflector post catching my headlights and throwing them back in brief golden winks. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling electronics from Phoenix to Denver, and I knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every place where the road dipped just enough to make your stomach flutter if you weren't paying attention. The familiar hum of my Peterbilt's engine had become a lullaby over the years, a steady bass note that helped pass the long hours between sunset and sunrise. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something different in my rearview mirror. The highway behind me should have been empty. It usually was at this hour, especially on this particular stretch through the high desert of New Mexico. But there was a car back there, maybe a quarter mile behind, its headlights creating 2 steady points of light in the darkness. Nothing unusual about that, really. Night drivers like myself weren't uncommon. People trying to beat the heat of the desert sun or simply preferring the solitude that came with traveling the empty highways after dark. What struck me as odd was how the car seemed to maintain that exact distance. I'd been watching it for the better part of an hour now, and whether I sped up slightly going downhill or slowed for the gentle curves that wound through the mesa country, those headlights stayed precisely where they were, not gaining, not falling back, just there, like a fixed star in my rectangular window to the world behind me. The radio crackled with static, picking up fragments of late-night talk shows from distant cities, conspiracy theories and relationship advice bleeding through the white noise. I reached over to adjust the tuning, trying to find something clearer when I caught another glimpse of the car in my mirror. For just a moment, in the brief illumination of an overpass light we'd both passed under, I could have sworn I saw something moving in the car's back window. Quick, frantic movement like someone waving their arms. I shook my head, blinking hard to clear my vision. Long-haul driving played tricks on your mind, especially in the small hours when your circadian rhythm was fighting against your caffeine-fueled determination to make good time. I'd seen phantom animals dart across the road, imagined faces in cloud formations, heard voices in the wind rushing past my cab. This was probably just more of the same, my tired brain trying to create drama where none existed. But the feeling nagged at me, a small knot of unease that settled in my stomach and refused to be dismissed. I adjusted my speed, letting the cruise control drop me down to 65, then 60. The headlights behind me grew neither larger nor smaller. They remained fixed in that same position, as if the car were tethered to my truck by an invisible chain. The landscape around us had grown more desolate, if such a thing were possible. We were passing through a stretch of desert where the closest town was 40 miles in either direction, where cell phone towers were scarce, and the radio stations faded to whispers. Red rock formations loomed like sleeping giants in the darkness, their surfaces painted silver by the moon. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, but tonight it felt oppressive, as if the emptiness itself were watching. I tried the CB radio, switching to channel 19 to see if there were any other truckers in the area. Sometimes a little conversation helped pass the miles and settle the nerves. Breaker 19. This is Phoenix Express eastbound at mile marker 214. Anybody got their ears on? Static answered me, long and hissing. I tried again, broadcasting my position and asking if anyone had seen a car following unusual patterns. But the airwaves remained silent except for the occasional pop of distant lightning. That's when I saw them more clearly, the movements in the car's rear window. During the brief moment when we passed under another overpass light, I caught a clear glimpse of what looked like hands, multiple sets of hands, pressed against the glass from inside. They moved frantically, seeming to beat against the window in urgent, desperate motions. My heart rate picked up, the steady rhythm of the engine suddenly sounding more ominous than comforting. I reached for my cell phone, thinking I should call the state police. If someone was in trouble in that car, if there was some kind of emergency or criminal activity happening, I had a responsibility to report it. But my phone showed no signal, just empty bars and a searching message that had been displaying for the last hour. Out here, we were truly isolated, cut off from the connected world that most people took for granted. The smart thing would have been to speed up, to put distance between myself and whatever was happening behind me. But something about those frantic movements in the rear window wouldn't let me simply drive away. What if someone was being kidnapped? What if there were children in that car, trying to signal for help? The thought of abandoning someone in genuine distress was worse than the growing fear that was making my palms sweat against the steering wheel. I began to slow down more noticeably, hoping the car would pass me. If I could get a look at the driver, maybe see license plates clearly, I could at least provide information to authorities when I reached a town with cell service. But as my speed dropped to 50, then 45, the car behind me slowed as well. Those headlights maintained their fixed distance like heavenly bodies locked in orbit. Now I could see more detail in my mirrors. It appeared to be a mid-sized sedan, dark-colored, maybe blue or black, though it was difficult to tell in the artificial light. The motion in the rear window had become more frantic, and I was certain now that there were multiple figures back there, their hands creating desperate patterns against the glass. But something about the movement struck me as wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what bothered me about them. The road ahead curved gently to the left, following the contours of an ancient mesa. As we navigated the turn, my truck's headlights swept across a historical marker sign, one of those brown monuments that dotted highways across the Southwest. In the brief moment of illumination, I caught sight of the text, Lost Souls Canyon, site of 1987 bus accident, 23 lives lost. The sign disappeared behind us, swallowed by darkness, but the words remained burned in my mind. I tried to remember if I'd ever heard about that accident. Searching through 15 years of highway stories and trucker folklore, sometimes drivers would mention crashes or incidents that had happened on various routes, creating an oral history of the dangerous or memorable spots along the interstate system. But this sign, this canyon, this stretch of road had always been just another section of asphalt to me, notable only for its emptiness and the way trucks could build up speed on the long downhill grades. The movements in the car behind me had changed. Instead of the frantic waving I'd observed before, the figures in the rear window now seemed to be pressing their faces against the glass. Even at this distance, even in the shifting light and shadow of the desert night, I could make out pale ovals that must have been faces, multiple faces crowded together, all turned toward my truck. The sight sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning humming in my cab. I reached for the CB radio again, this time switching through multiple channels, trying to raise anyone who might be listening. Mayday, mayday, this is eastbound truck at mile marker 220. I've got a possible emergency situation, can anyone hear me? Nothing but static answered, punctuated by the occasional electronic squeal that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The car behind me wasn't just maintaining its distance, it was maintaining its position without regard to the laws of physics. As we crested a small hill, my truck naturally slowed due to the grade and the weight of my load. The car should have had to brake to avoid closing the gap, but instead it seemed to simply float at that same fixed distance, as if momentum and inertia had no effect on it. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig faster than was safe on the winding desert highway. 65 became 70, then 75. The engine roared, working harder to maintain speed while pulling 40,000 pounds of cargo up and down the rolling terrain. But no matter how fast I drove, those headlights remained exactly where they had been for the past 2 hours, and the faces in the rear window continued their silent pressing against the glass. Silent. That word stuck in my mind as I realized what had been bothering me about the whole situation. I'd been assuming the figures in the car were trying to signal for help, trying to attract my attention to some emergency. But in all this time, with all their frantic movement and desperate gesturing, I'd never once seen any attempt to communicate through sound. No one had tried to lean out a window to shout. No one had flashed the car's lights in the universal